Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Impossible Call. Joshua Horn was reviewing security protocols for his latest corporate client when his phone shattered the afternoon silence. The caller ID showed St. Mary's Medical Center, a hospital he'd never set foot in. "Mr. Horn," the voice was gravelly, tired. "This is Dr. Raymond Sims. I'm afraid I have terrible news about your son." Joshua's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm sorry, doctor, but there's been a mistake. I don't have a son." "Sir, please don't make this more difficult than it already is." Dr. Sims sounded impatient, almost rehearsed. "Your son Tyler Horn was brought in 3 hours ago after a motorcycle accident. We tried everything, but his injuries were too severe. I need you to come down and sign the death certificate." "Listen carefully," Joshua said, his military training kicking in. "I don't have a son named Tyler or any other name. I've never been married before my current wife, and we don't have children. You've got the wrong person. Mr. Horn, your son had your emergency contact information in his wallet. Your address, your phone number. We've confirmed your identity through his medical records. Please, just come down to room 302. We need to handle this quickly due to state regulations." The line went dead. Joshua stared at his phone, mind racing. 15 years in military intelligence had taught him to trust his instincts, and every alarm bell in his head was screaming. Someone was playing a game, and he was the unwilling participant. But curiosity had always been both his strength and his weakness. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, texting his wife Melissa, "Going to check something at the hospital. Back soon." Her response came quickly. "Everything okay?" "Red heart. Just a misunderstanding. Love you." The drive to St. Mary's took 20 minutes through downtown traffic. Joshua used the time to think. Who could possibly have enough information about him to create a fake emergency contact? His security consulting firm had made him enemies, corporate executives he'd exposed for data breaches, employees he'd caught selling secrets. But this felt more personal. St. Mary's Medical Center was a sprawling complex that looked like it had seen better decades. Joshua parked and made his way through the maze of corridors to the third floor. Room 302 was at the end of a dimly lit hallway. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The body in the bed was that of a young man, maybe 19 or 20, with sandy brown hair and sharp features. But what made Joshua's blood run cold wasn't the stranger's face. It was the wedding ring on the supposed victim's finger. A ring identical to his own, down to the custom engraving on the inside. "Imanje forever." "Mr. Horn." Dr. Sims appeared behind him, clipboard in hand. He was a thin man with nervous eyes and hands that shook slightly. "I know this is difficult, but we need to handle the paperwork." Joshua studied the doctor carefully. "How did you say my son died?" "Motorcycle accident on Highway 95. He was speeding, lost control around a curve. The bike burst into flames, but we managed to pull him out. He died en route to the hospital." "Strange," Joshua said, moving closer to the bed. "He doesn't look burned." Dr. Sims shifted uncomfortably. The paramedics got to him quickly. Most of the damage was internal, massive head trauma. Joshua nodded slowly, then reached into his jacket. Dr. Sims flinched, but Joshua only pulled out his phone. "Mind if I take a photo?" "For insurance purposes." That's not really protocol. Neither is calling someone about a child that isn't theirs." Joshua's voice carried the edge he'd perfected interrogating terrorists in Afghanistan. "Unless you can explain how this young man has my exact wedding ring." The doctor's face went white. There must be some mistake." "Yes, there is." Joshua stepped closer, and Dr. Sims backed toward the door. "The mistake was thinking I'd be stupid enough to fall for this." "Who put you up to this? Who's paying you to play dead son with a stranger's corpse?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Dr. Sims stammered. "You need to sign these papers, and actually, I think I'll call the police instead." Joshua pulled out his phone. "Let them sort out why someone is trying to establish a fake parental relationship between me and a corpse. That's identity fraud at minimum, probably part of something much bigger." Dr. Sims dropped the clipboard and bolted from the room. Joshua didn't chase him. Instead, he carefully photographed everything: the body, the wedding ring, the medical charts clipped to the bed. Then he called his friend Detective Pablo Finley with the Metro PD. "Pablo, it's Josh. I need you to run a check on a Dr. Raymond Sims at St. Mary's Medical Center. And I need it fast." "What's going on, brother?" "Someone just tried to convince me I have a dead son. Either this is the world's most elaborate prank, or someone setting me up for something big." After hanging up, Joshua took one more look at the body. The young man was definitely dead, probably had been for hours based on the lividity. But this wasn't about a motorcycle accident. This was about someone wanting Joshua Horn to be officially connected to a corpse. The question was why. As he left the hospital, Joshua noticed a black sedan in the parking lot with tinted windows. The engine was running, but no one got out. He memorized the license plate and made a mental note to have it traced. Someone was watching him, which meant whatever this was, it was just beginning. Chapter 2. Threads of Deception. Pablo Finley's call came at 6 a.m. the next morning. "Josh, we need to talk. Can you meet me at Murphy's Diner in 20 minutes? What did you find on Dr. Sims?" "Not over the phone. Just get here." Murphy's Diner was a cop hangout on the outskirts of downtown, the kind of place where conversation stayed private and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. Pablo was already in a corner booth, his detective shield visible on his belt, looking like he hadn't slept. "Raymond Sims isn't a doctor," Pablo said without preamble. He isn't even Raymond Sims. Real name is Ernie Randall, small-time con artist with a sheet going back 15 years. Fraud, identity theft, check kiting, never anything violent, but he's good at playing roles. Joshua slid into the opposite booth. "Someone hired him to play doctor?" "Gets better. I ran that license plate you gave me. The sedan belongs to a rental company, leased to a corporation called Farrell Holdings. CEO is a guy named Vernon Farrell." The name meant nothing to Joshua, but Pablo's expression suggested it should. "Never heard of him." "Farrell's interesting. 42 years old, no criminal record, but his business ventures all have one thing in common. They target successful men going through divorces. He swoops in, befriends the wife, helps her get the best lawyers, usually ends up with a piece of the settlement. And sometimes he ends up with the wife." "You're saying he's a professional homewrecker?" "I'm saying he's smart about it. Never anything prosecutable, just a pattern of broken marriages and transferred assets. His current target seems to be someone close to you." Joshua felt ice forming in his chest. "Melissa." Pablo nodded grimly. "I did some digging after you called. Your wife has been meeting with Vernon Farrell for 3 weeks. Coffee dates, lunch meetings, evening drinks. Always when you're working late." The betrayal hit harder than any physical blow Joshua had ever taken. 3 weeks. Melissa had been planning something for 3 weeks, and he'd been completely blind to it. "There's more," Pablo continued. "I checked the John Doe from yesterday. The kid in room 302. His real name was Tyler Farrell. Vernon's son from a previous relationship. His own son." Joshua's military mind was already processing the implications. "He killed his own child to set me up. Kid died 2 days ago in a motorcycle accident, exactly like Dr. Sims described. But it happened in Nevada, not here. Vernon had the body transported and paid Randall to play his little scene with you." "But why? What's the endgame?" Pablo pulled out a manila folder. "That's where it gets really twisted. Farrell's been building a case that you're Tyler's biological father. Fake DNA tests, forged medical records, backdated birth certificates. If you had signed those death papers yesterday, you would have legally acknowledged paternity of his dead son, setting me up for a wrongful death lawsuit. Bigger than that, once he established you as Tyler's father, he could claim you abandoned the kid, never paid child support, were negligent in your parental duties. He'd have civil grounds to go after everything you own. And with Melissa as his inside source on your assets." Joshua's hands clenched into fists. Vernon Farrell wasn't just stealing his wife. He was trying to steal his entire life. The elaborate hospital setup was just the opening move in a long-term con designed to destroy everything Joshua had built. How long do I have before they make their next move? Based on his previous targets? Not long. Farrell likes to work fast once the pieces are in place. Days, maybe a week. Joshua stood up, his mind already formulating a plan. Pablo, I need you to do something for me, and it has to stay off the books. What do you need? I want you to arrest Ernie Randall for fraud and impersonating a medical professional. But don't book him right away. Give me 30 minutes with him first. Josh, I can't let you. I'm not going to hurt him. I just need information, and he'll talk faster to me than to you. You know I'm good at getting people to talk. Pablo studied his friend's face. They'd served together in Afghanistan, and he'd seen Joshua extract information from hardened terrorists using nothing but psychological pressure and strategic silence. 30 minutes. After that, he goes into the system. That's all I need. By noon, Joshua had the full scope of Vernon Farrell's operation. Randall had been surprisingly cooperative once he realized he was facing serious jail time for medical fraud. Farrell had been planning this con for 6 months, ever since he'd identified Melissa Horn as the wife of a successful security consultant with significant assets and no children. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: destroy Joshua's reputation and finances through fraudulent lawsuits, while simultaneously positioning himself as Melissa's protector and new love interest. Once Joshua was financially ruined and emotionally devastated, Vernon would marry Melissa and gain control of whatever assets remained. But Vernon had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated his target. Joshua Horn wasn't some suburban husband who would crumble under pressure. He was a former military intelligence officer who specialized in psychological warfare and strategic planning. And now that he knew the game being played, he was going to play it better. The first step was confirmation. He needed to see Vernon and Melissa together, needed to watch their interactions and understand the depth of his wife's betrayal. It would hurt, but pain was just information, and information was power. He drove to Melissa's favorite restaurant, a trendy bistro downtown where she often had lunch with her book club friends. Sure enough, her car was in the parking lot, and sitting across from her at a window table was a handsome man with salt and pepper hair and an expensive suit. Vernon Farrell looked exactly like what he was, a predator dressed as a gentleman. Joshua watched from his car as Melissa laughed at something Vernon said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Her wedding ring, the one that matched the ring on his dead son's finger, caught the sunlight. His phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. Book club is running long today. Don't wait up for dinner. Love you. The lie was so casual, so practiced, that Joshua wondered how many others there had been. He took photos of them together, documenting their body language, their obvious intimacy. Evidence for later. Then he drove home to plan his counterattack. Vernon Farrell wanted to play games with a dead son and a cheating wife? Fine. But Joshua was going to change the rules. Chapter 3. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. That evening, Joshua sat in his home office staring at 3 computer screens filled with information about Vernon Farrell. His military intelligence training had taught him that knowledge was the ultimate weapon, and he was building an arsenal. Vernon Farrell, age 42, born in Detroit. Parents died in a car crash when he was 16. Bounced between foster homes until he aged out of the system. No college degree, but highly intelligent with a gift for reading people and exploiting weaknesses. His business success came from carefully orchestrated cons targeting wealthy divorcees. What made Vernon dangerous wasn't his criminal intent, it was his patience. He spent months studying his targets, learning their habits, their vulnerabilities, their loved ones. By the time he made his move, he knew his victims better than they knew themselves. But Vernon had made a critical error in targeting Joshua Horn. Military intelligence officers were trained to spot deception, to see patterns in chaos, to think 10 moves ahead. And Joshua had spent 15 years honing those skills against enemies far more dangerous than a mid-level con artist. Working late again? Melissa's voice from the doorway made him jump. She was wearing the blue dress he'd bought her for their anniversary, the one she claimed was her favorite. Just finishing up some client reports. He minimized the screens and turned to face her. How was book club? Oh, you know how it is. We spent more time gossiping than discussing the actual book. Her smile was perfect, practiced. Sarah's getting divorced, and Monica's thinking about leaving her husband. Sometimes I wonder if any marriages actually work anymore. The casual cruelty of the comment hit him like a physical blow. She was talking about destroying other people's marriages while actively betraying her own. What do you think makes marriages fail? He asked, studying her face. I think people grow apart. They stop communicating, stop trying to understand each other. And sometimes, she paused, looking out the window. Sometimes someone comes along who makes you remember what it feels like to be truly seen and appreciated. Someone like who? For just a moment, her mask slipped. Joshua saw a flash of guilt, quickly covered by defensiveness. It's just theoretical, Josh. Don't read too much into it. After she went upstairs to shower, Joshua reopened his files. Melissa thought she was being subtle, but every word, every gesture confirmed what he already knew. She'd been thoroughly manipulated by a master craftsman, and she didn't even realize it. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We should meet. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Riverside Park. Come alone. VF. Vernon Farrell wanted a face-to-face meeting. Interesting. Joshua typed back. Why would I meet with someone who uses dead children to commit fraud? The response came quickly. Because I have something you want, and you have something I need. Let's be civilized about this. What could you possibly have that I want? Your wife's happiness. And her future. Don't you want what's best for Melissa? Joshua stared at the message, recognizing the psychological manipulation, even as he felt its impact. Vernon was positioning himself as Melissa's protector, implying that Joshua was the obstacle to her happiness. It was textbook emotional blackmail, but effective nonetheless. He spent the night planning his approach to the meeting. Vernon would expect him to be angry, desperate, maybe violent. Instead, Joshua would give him something unexpected, a worthy opponent who refused to be manipulated. Riverside Park at 2 p.m. was busy with joggers, families, and office workers on lunch break. Vernon had chosen the location well, public enough to prevent violence, but with enough ambient noise to ensure privacy. He was sitting on a bench near the river, reading a newspaper like he didn't have a care in the world. Mr. Horn. Vernon stood as Joshua approached, extending his hand like they were old friends meeting for coffee. Thank you for coming. Joshua ignored the handshake. Let's get this over with. Fair enough. I'll be direct. Vernon sat back down, completely relaxed. Your marriage is over. Melissa doesn't love you anymore, hasn't for months. She's staying out of habit and financial security, but emotionally, she's already moved on. To you, to the idea of something better. I just happen to represent that possibility. Vernon's smile was cold, but not cruel. This was business to him. I can make this ugly. Drag you through courts, destroy your reputation, take everything you've worked for. The Tyler situation was just a preview of what I can do. Or we handle this like gentlemen. You give Melissa an uncontested divorce with a generous settlement. She gets to start fresh with someone who appreciates her. You get to keep most of your assets and your dignity. Everyone wins. Joshua sat down on the bench, maintaining careful distance. Except for your dead son. He definitely didn't win. For the first time, Vernon's composure cracked. Tyler was an accident. A real accident. I just repurposed the situation. You used your own child's corpse as a prop in a con game. I used available resources to achieve a necessary outcome. Vernon's voice hardened. Tyler was already dead. Nothing I did changed that. But his death could serve a purpose. Help me build a better life for the woman I love. You don't love her. She's a mark. You're wrong about that, Mr. Horn. Melissa is different. Special. She deserves better than a husband who treats her like a security asset to be protected instead of a woman to be cherished. The comment stung because it contained a grain of truth. Joshua's military background had made him protective to the point of being controlling. He'd always seen threats everywhere, had built his life like a fortress with Melissa safely inside. Maybe that hadn't left much room for romance or spontaneity. But that didn't justify what Vernon was doing. Here's my counteroffer, Joshua said calmly. You disappear. Today. Leave town, leave Melissa alone, and never contact either of us again. In exchange, I don't tell the police that you desecrated your son's corpse and committed multiple felonies in pursuit of an elaborate con game. Vernon laughed. You think I'm afraid of the police? I've been very careful. No laws broken that can't be explained away as misunderstandings or coincidences. What about bribing Ernie Randall to impersonate a doctor? Ernie who? I don't know anyone by that name. The rental car registered to Farrell Holdings? I rent a lot of cars. Can't keep track of them all. Vernon was right. He'd been careful. Everything could be explained away or denied. The only real evidence was Tyler's body, and that would just confirm that Vernon was a grieving father making poor decisions. Then we have a problem, Joshua said, because I'm not going anywhere, and neither is my marriage. Your marriage ended weeks ago, Mr. Horn. You just haven't accepted it yet. Vernon stood to leave. I'll give you 48 hours to reconsider. After that, things get unpleasant for everyone involved. As Vernon walked away, Joshua remained on the bench, watching the river flow past. His opponent was smart, careful, and completely ruthless. The kind of enemy who required special tactics. That evening, Melissa was unusually affectionate over dinner, asking about his day, sharing stories from her book club, acting like the loving wife she'd always been. But Joshua now recognized it for what it was: guilt management. She was easing her conscience by being extra kind before she destroyed their life together. I've been thinking, she said as they cleaned up the kitchen. Maybe we should take a vacation. Get away from work and stress. Just focus on each other for a while. Where did you have in mind? I don't know. Somewhere romantic. Paris, maybe, or that place in Tuscany you showed me in the travel magazine. A farewell tour. Vernon had probably suggested it. One last romantic trip before she filed for divorce. It would make her feel less guilty about what came next. That sounds wonderful, Joshua said, pulling her into his arms. Let's do it. She smiled and kissed him, and for just a moment, he almost believed it was real. But as they went upstairs together, Joshua's mind was already working on his counter-strategy. Vernon Farrell thought he was playing chess with an amateur. He was about to discover that Joshua Horn played by different rules entirely. Chapter 4. The Art of War. 3 days later, Joshua sat at his office reviewing intelligence reports like he was planning a military operation, which, in a way, he was. Vernon Farrell had declared war on his marriage and his life. Now it was time to return the favor. The first principle of asymmetric warfare was to never fight on your enemy's chosen battleground. Vernon expected Joshua to react emotionally, to confront Melissa, to lash out, to make mistakes driven by anger and heartbreak. Instead, Joshua was going to be cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. Pablo Finley knocked on the office door and entered carrying a thick file folder. You're not going to like what I found, but you need to know. How bad is it? Vernon's been busy since you met with him. He filed a wrongful death lawsuit against you yesterday, claiming you're Tyler's father and seeking damages for abandonment and emotional distress. He's also initiated proceedings to have Tyler's body examined for DNA evidence. Joshua felt a chill. Can he do that legally? With the right court order, yes. And he's got a lawyer who specializes in paternity cases. The whole thing is designed to create public scandal and legal bills that will bleed you dry even if you eventually win. What about Melissa? Pablo's expression darkened. She filed a temporary restraining order this morning, claiming you've been emotionally abusive and she fears for her safety. It's complete fiction, but it gets you out of your own house and freezes access to joint assets. The brilliance of Vernon's strategy was becoming clear. While Joshua had been planning his response, Vernon had been implementing a coordinated legal attack designed to isolate and impoverish his target. Classic manipulation: create a crisis, then position yourself as the solution. There's more, Pablo continued. I ran a deeper background check on Vernon. Turns out he's done this exact same playbook 5 times in the past 10 years. Always targets successful men with assets and no children. Always uses legal warfare to destroy their finances while positioning himself as the wrong party or the protective new boyfriend. What happened to his previous targets? 2 suicides, 1 bankruptcy and disappeared. 1 moved to another country. 1 ended up in a mental institution. Vernon's got a perfect record of destroying lives. Joshua studied the photographs of Vernon's previous victims. They were all successful, intelligent men who'd been reduced to broken shells of their former selves. Men who'd fought Vernon's war using conventional tactics and lost everything. But here's the interesting part, Pablo continued. In each case, Vernon eventually tired of his new conquest and moved on to the next target. The wives he rescued all ended up abandoned within 2 years, usually after he'd gained control of whatever assets remained. So Melissa's not his endgame. She's just another stepping stone. Exactly. Which means he doesn't actually care about her. She's just a useful tool for getting to your money. That changed everything. Joshua had been operating under the assumption that Vernon genuinely wanted Melissa for herself. But if she was just another mark in a long-term pattern, then Vernon's emotional investment was minimal. That created opportunities. I need you to do something for me, Pablo. Completely off the books. What do you need? I want surveillance on Vernon. 24 hours a day for the next week. I need to know his patterns, his contacts, his weaknesses. And I need to know if he's already scouting his next target. Josh, that's expensive and time-consuming. And technically illegal without a warrant. I'll pay for it myself. And I'll take full responsibility if anything goes wrong. Pablo studied his friend's face. You're planning something. I'm planning to win. That afternoon, Joshua received a call from his lawyer confirming what Pablo had already told him. The legal attacks were comprehensive and well-orchestrated. Fighting them conventionally would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and take years, during which Vernon would be free to continue his manipulation. But Joshua wasn't planning to fight conventionally. Instead, he called Vernon directly. Mr. Farrell, it's Joshua Horn. I'd like to discuss your offer. I'm glad you're seeing reason, Mr. Horn. Are you ready to be sensible about the divorce settlement? I think we can work something out, but I'd prefer to discuss it in person. Can you meet me tonight? Of course. Where? My office. Horn Security Consulting on 5th Street. Come alone. Vernon's laugh was confident. I don't think you're in a position to make demands, Mr. Horn. Your wife is terrified of you. The courts are freezing your assets, and you're facing a wrongful death lawsuit that will destroy whatever reputation you have left. Then you have nothing to fear from meeting with a broken man in his empty office. There was a pause. Vernon was calculating, trying to read the tone, the implications. Fine. 8 o'clock. But if this is some kind of trap, what could I possibly do to hurt you? You've already won. Joshua spent the remaining hours preparing his office for the meeting. Hidden cameras, audio recording equipment, and most importantly, a complete psychological profile of Vernon Farrell based on his previous victims and their testimonies. Vernon arrived precisely at 8, dressed in an expensive suit and radiating confidence. He looked around the office approvingly, awards on the walls, photos of Joshua's military service, evidence of a successful career he was about to lose. Nice setup, Vernon said. Shame you're going to have to liquidate it all to pay your legal bills. About that, Joshua said, gesturing for Vernon to sit. I've been thinking about what you said. About Melissa deserving better. About the futility of fighting your legal campaign. And, you're right. I can't win a war of attrition against someone with your resources and patience. And more importantly, I can't force my wife to love me if she doesn't. Vernon's smile was triumphant. I'm glad you're being realistic. But I have a proposition. A way we can both get what we want without destroying each other in the process. I'm listening. Joshua leaned back in his chair, adopting a defeated posture. You want Melissa and my assets. I want to salvage what's left of my life and start over somewhere else. What if we could arrange that without the messy publicity of multiple lawsuits? What are you suggesting? A private settlement. I give Melissa an uncontested divorce with a generous settlement, say 60% of our joint assets. You drop the wrongful death lawsuit. Everyone walks away intact. Vernon considered this. What's the catch? No catch. Just one condition. I want to understand how you did it. Professional curiosity. You outplayed me completely, and I'd like to know how. Vernon's ego couldn't resist. For the next hour, he laid out his entire operation. How he'd researched Joshua's background, identified Melissa as the perfect access point, orchestrated their first accidental meeting at her gym, spent weeks building trust and emotional dependence. The key is patience, Vernon explained. Most men rush the seduction, try to move too fast. But Melissa needed to feel like she was making the choice herself. I just created the conditions where betraying you felt like the logical thing to do. And the dead son angle? That was inspired by something I read about military psychology. Soldiers are trained to respond to distress calls, to protect civilians in danger. I knew you'd respond to a call about a dying child, even if it didn't make logical sense. It was supposed to establish paternity so I could claim you abandoned Tyler and owed damages. Except I didn't sign the papers. A minor setback. The lawsuit still creates financial pressure and public scandal. By the time it's resolved, you'll be broke and Melissa will be married to someone else. Vernon was so pleased with his own cleverness that he didn't notice Joshua's growing smile. There's just one thing I don't understand, Joshua said. Why Melissa? Why not target someone with more assets and fewer complications? Honestly, she was supposed to be practice. A smaller target to refine my technique before going after someone really wealthy. Vernon shrugged, but then I realized she had qualities I valued beyond just the money. She's intelligent, beautiful, sophisticated. I decided to keep her. For how long? What do you mean? Your previous targets. You discarded their wives within 2 years. What makes Melissa different? For the first time, Vernon looked uncomfortable. I don't know what you're talking about. Sarah Kemp in Denver. Monica Weeks in Phoenix. Catherine Peterson in Seattle. Should I continue? The confident smile faded from Vernon's face. You've been investigating me. Of course I have. Did you think I'd just roll over and accept defeat? Joshua stood up, and suddenly the dynamic in the room shifted. You made one crucial mistake, Vernon. You assumed I was just another suburban husband who would collapse under pressure. But I'm not. What are you? I'm a former military intelligence officer who specializes in psychological warfare and strategic deception. Everything you've done to me, every manipulation, every legal maneuver, every emotional attack, I've used those same techniques against enemy combatants. The only difference is that my targets usually ended up dead. Vernon stood up quickly, backing toward the door. You're threatening me. I'm educating you. For the past hour, you've been confessing to multiple felonies while being recorded by hidden cameras and microphones. Fraud, extortion, conspiracy, desecration of a corpse. Should I continue? Those recordings would never hold up in court. You didn't inform me I was being recorded. I don't need them to hold up in court. I just need them to destroy your reputation and expose your pattern of behavior to your current and future victims. Vernon's face went pale. What do you want? I want you to understand that this isn't a game you can win. I want you to realize that you picked the wrong target. And I want you to start running. You can't prove anything. I can prove everything. Your financial records, your previous victims, your systematic destruction of marriages and lives. I can connect you to every crime you've committed and every life you've destroyed. Joshua moved closer, and Vernon pressed back against the door. But more importantly, I can make sure that every woman you try to target in the future knows exactly what you are. This isn't over. Yes, it is. You just don't know it yet. Vernon fumbled for the door handle and fled, leaving behind the confident predator persona and revealing the coward underneath. Joshua sat back down at his desk and made a phone call. Pablo, it's time for Phase 2. Chapter 5, The Unraveling. The next morning, Melissa called Joshua at his office, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. We need to talk. Can you meet me for coffee? I thought you had a restraining order against me. I'm dropping it. There are complications. They met at a neutral location, a busy Starbucks downtown where public scrutiny would prevent any dramatic scenes. Melissa looked exhausted, her usual polished appearance replaced by dark circles under her eyes and trembling hands wrapped around her coffee cup. Vernon's been arrested, she said without preamble. Joshua feigned surprise. For what? Fraud. Identity theft. Something about a fake doctor and forged medical records. She looked up at him with confused, hurt eyes. Josh, what is going on? Vernon said you two had worked everything out, that you were going to give me an uncontested divorce. Then, this morning the police came to his apartment and arrested him. Maybe there's more to Vernon than you realized. Don't play games with me. I know you had something to do with this. Her voice carried a mixture of anger and desperation. The police are asking me questions about our relationship, about what Vernon told me about you, about whether I knew he wasn't really a doctor. Joshua studied his wife's face, looking for any sign that she understood the depth of Vernon's deception. What he saw instead was a woman clinging to her last illusions about a man who had systematically manipulated her for months. What did you tell them? The truth. That Vernon is a good man who was trying to help me get out of an unhappy marriage. That whatever he did wrong, it was probably because he was trying to protect me from you. The loyalty in her voice was heartbreaking because it was so misplaced. Vernon had convinced her that Joshua was the villain in their story, and she was still defending her manipulator even after his arrest. Melissa, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Vernon Farrell is not who you think he is. Oh, and you're going to tell me who he really is? The man who's been ignoring me for months, who treats our marriage like a business arrangement, who's so paranoid about security that I feel like I'm living in a prison. Her words stung because they weren't entirely wrong. Joshua's military background had made him protective to the point of being controlling. He'd prioritized their physical safety and financial security over emotional intimacy, and that had created the vulnerability Vernon had exploited. You're right about some of that, he admitted. I haven't been the husband you needed, but that doesn't make Vernon the solution. At least Vernon sees me as a woman instead of an asset to be protected. Joshua pulled out a manila folder and set it on the table between them. Vernon has destroyed 5 marriages in the past 10 years. He targets successful men, seduces their wives, then uses legal warfare to steal their assets. Once he's taken everything, he abandons the women and moves on to the next target. Melissa stared at the folder without opening it. I don't believe you. Sarah Kemp thought her husband was emotionally abusive too. So did Monica Weeks and Catherine Peterson. They all thought Vernon was their knight in shining armor, right up until he disappeared with their money and left them with nothing. You're lying. The police reports are all in there. Testimony from his previous victims. Financial records showing his pattern of behavior. Vernon isn't in love with you, Melissa. You're just his current mark. She opened the folder with shaking hands and began reading. Joshua watched the color drain from her face as she absorbed the evidence. Photographs of Vernon with other women, court documents from previous lawsuits, testimonials from wives who'd been abandoned after Vernon had achieved his financial objectives. This can't be real, she whispered. There's more. Vernon's son, the one who died in the motorcycle accident. He's been using that boy's death as a weapon against me. He transported the body illegally, hired a fake doctor to trick me into signing paternity papers. Also, he could file a wrongful death lawsuit and destroy me financially. Melissa looked up from the documents, her eyes filled with tears. He used his own child's death. He told me Tyler was just available resources to achieve his objectives. That's how he sees everything: people, relationships, even his own family. Just tools to be used and discarded. The full scope of her betrayal was sinking in now. She hadn't just been unfaithful. She'd been completely manipulated by a predator who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice barely audible. Josh, I'm so sorry. I believed. You believed what he wanted you to believe. That's what makes him dangerous. How did I not see it? How was I so blind? Joshua reached across the table and took her hand. The first time he'd touched her with genuine tenderness in months. Because he's very good at what he does. And because our marriage had real problems that made you vulnerable to his manipulation. They sat in silence for several minutes while Melissa processed the devastating revelation that the man she'd fallen in love with was a professional con artist who'd never cared about her at all. What happens now? She finally asked. Now you decide what you want. If you want a divorce, I'll give you one. If you want to try to rebuild our marriage, I'm willing to do the work. But first, we need to make sure Vernon pays for what he's done. How? The police have enough evidence to convict him on fraud charges, but that's just the beginning. I've been in contact with his previous victims, and they're all willing to testify about his pattern of behavior. We can make sure he goes to prison for a very long time. Melissa nodded slowly. I want to help. I want to make this right. It's going to be difficult. The media will probably pick up the story, and you'll have to testify about the affair, about the things Vernon told you about me. Are you prepared for that? I deserve whatever consequences come from this. I betrayed you. I betrayed our marriage, and I helped a predator try to destroy an innocent man. She looked directly into his eyes. I know you might never forgive me, and I understand if you don't want to try to save our marriage. But I want you to know that what I felt for Vernon wasn't real. It was manufactured, manipulated. What we had together, that was real, even if I lost sight of it. For the first time in weeks, Joshua felt a spark of hope. The woman he'd married was still there, underneath the confusion and manipulation. Whether they could rebuild their relationship remained to be seen, but at least now they were both fighting the same enemy. There's something else you need to know, he said. Vernon's not done. He's lost this round, but he's facing serious prison time. Desperate people do desperate things. As if summoned by his words, Joshua's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This isn't over. You took everything from me. Now I'm going to take everything from you. He showed the message to Melissa, who went pale. Is he threatening us? He's threatening me. But you're with me now, which makes you a target too. Joshua's military training was already shifting into high alert mode. Vernon Farrell was no longer playing a long-term con game. He was in immediate crisis mode, which made him far more dangerous and unpredictable. What do? We finish this, once and for all. Chapter 6, The Desperate Gambit. Vernon Farrell made bail within 24 hours, his expensive lawyer arguing successfully that he was a flight risk but not a danger to the community. It was a tactical error by the prosecution that Joshua had expected. The legal system wasn't designed to handle sophisticated psychological predators who operated within technical legal boundaries. But Joshua wasn't constrained by legal boundaries. Pablo Finley called him at midnight with disturbing news. Vernon's not at his apartment. My surveillance team lost him 3 hours ago. His car's still in the parking garage, but he's gone. Any idea where he might go? He's got contacts all over the country from his previous operations. Could be anywhere. But Josh, there's something else. We found evidence that he's been planning something big, rental agreements for industrial equipment, cash withdrawals from multiple accounts, purchases of chemicals and electronics. What kind of chemicals? The kind that explode. Joshua felt ice in his veins. Vernon had shifted from psychological warfare to physical violence, which meant everyone in Joshua's life was now at risk. Where's Melissa? Safe house, like you requested. But she's asking to see you. Absolutely not. Vernon might be watching for exactly that kind of movement. But even as he said it, Joshua knew that hiding wasn't a long-term solution. Vernon was smart, patient, and now completely desperate. He would find a way to strike, and when he did, Joshua wanted to be ready. The call came at 3 a.m., Vernon's voice distorted by some kind of electronic device. You destroyed my life, Joshua, my business, my reputation, my future. All for what? A cheating wife who never loved you anyway. Where are you, Vernon? Close enough to matter. Far enough to stay safe. For now, what do you want? I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything. Your business, your assets, your sense of security. But most of all, I want you to know what it's like to be responsible for someone else's death. The line went dead. Joshua immediately called Pablo. He's going to target someone close to me. We need to expand protection to everyone, my employees, my friends, anyone he might see as leverage. Already on it. But Josh, we can't protect everyone forever. This guy's got to make a move soon, and when he does, we need to be ready. I have an idea, but you're not going to like it. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it's time to give Vernon what he wants, a chance to destroy me personally. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Joshua would make himself vulnerable, create an irresistible target that Vernon couldn't ignore, then turn the trap around on his hunter. It required him to become bait in his own snare, but it was the only way to end this without more innocent people getting hurt. He sent a message to Vernon through a secure channel that he knew his enemy was monitoring. You want to finish this? Meet me tomorrow night, 11 p.m., at the old Riverside Industrial Complex. Come alone, and we'll settle this once and for all. The response came within minutes, finally showing some courage. See you there. The Riverside Industrial Complex was an abandoned manufacturing plant on the outskirts of town, isolated, dark, with multiple entry and exit points. perfect for Vernon's purposes, which was exactly why Joshua had chosen it. He spent the day preparing, placing hidden cameras and motion sensors throughout the complex, studying the layout, identifying potential weapons and escape routes. Pablo argued for a full SWAT presence, but Joshua overruled him. Vernon's too smart for a conventional police operation. He'll see it coming and disappear. This has to look like a personal confrontation between the two of us. And if he really has explosives? If this is some kind of murder-suicide scenario, then I'll deal with it. But I don't think that's his endgame. Vernon's a predator, not a martyr. He wants to win, not just hurt me. That evening, Melissa called from the safe house. Don't do this, Josh. Let the police handle it. The police had their chance. They let him make bail, and now he's escalated to threats of violence. This ends tonight, one way or another. I can't lose you. Not after everything we've been through, everything I've done wrong. Please, you're not going to lose me. Vernon's good at manipulation and long-term planning, but he's not a soldier. I've been in actual combat against enemies who are trying to kill me. One desperate con artist isn't going to be my downfall. Promise me you'll come home. I promise. At 10:45 p.m., Joshua entered the abandoned industrial complex alone. His phone, his weapons, his recording equipment, everything was in place. Hidden throughout the building were Pablo's surveillance teams, positioned to observe but not interfere unless Joshua's life was in immediate danger. Vernon was already there, waiting in the main assembly area like a spider in the center of its web. He looked different, disheveled, manic, no longer the polished predator Joshua had faced before. You came, Vernon said. I wasn't sure you would. I keep my word. Unlike some people. The moral high ground. How does it feel up there, Joshua? Does it make you feel superior to those of us who have to claw our way through life? It feels better than being a parasite who destroys families for money. Vernon laughed, but there was no humor in it. Families? You mean like the family I lost because of you? Tyler's dead. My business is ruined, and the woman I love thinks I'm a monster. All because you couldn't accept that your wife didn't want you anymore. Melissa was never the real target, and we both know it. You were using her to get to my assets, just like you used all the others. Maybe at first, but it became more than that. She made me want to be better, to build something real instead of just taking from others. Vernon's voice carried genuine pain. And you destroyed that. For a moment, Joshua almost felt sympathy for his enemy. Almost. You destroyed it yourself when you chose to use your dead son as a weapon. Whatever feelings you had for Melissa became irrelevant the moment you decided to desecrate Tyler's body to further your con game. Vernon's face twisted with rage. Don't you dare judge me. Tyler was my son, and I'll use his death however I see fit. He never gave me anything in life. At least in death he could serve a purpose. And there's the real Vernon Farrell. Not the grieving father or the love-struck suitor, but a sociopath who sees his own child as a tool to be used. We're all tools, Joshua. The only question is whether we're willing to use ourselves and others to get what we want. You pretend to be noble, but you've killed people. I've read your military record. How many men died because of your decisions? The difference is that I killed enemies who were trying to harm innocent people. You destroy innocence to serve your own greed. Innocence like your precious Melissa? She betrayed you willingly. I didn't force her into my bed. She came there because you weren't man enough to keep her satisfied. The words were designed to provoke an emotional response, to make Joshua angry and careless. Instead, they confirmed what he already suspected. Vernon was no longer thinking strategically. He was operating on pure emotion, which made him predictable. Is that why you brought me here? To gloat about sleeping with my wife. I brought you here to offer you a choice. Walk away. Leave town tonight. Never contact Melissa again, and I'll let you live. Stay, and I'll destroy everything you care about, starting with you. And if I refuse? Vernon reached into his jacket and pulled out a detonator device. Then we both die tonight, along with anyone else who gets in my way. I've rigged this entire building with explosives. One button push, and it all comes down. Joshua studied the device, his military training automatically analyzing the threat. The detonator looked real, and Vernon had certainly had time to plant explosives throughout the building. But something felt wrong about the scenario. You're bluffing. Am I? Are you willing to bet your life on that assessment? I'm willing to bet my life that you're not suicidal. Everything you've done has been about improving your position, gaining assets, building a better life. Blowing yourself up doesn't accomplish any of those objectives. Maybe my objectives have changed. Maybe destroying you is worth dying for. But even as he said it, Vernon was backing toward an exit door, not the behavior of someone planning to detonate himself along with his enemy. The explosives are real, Joshua said, working through the logic. But you're not planning to die with me. You've got an escape route planned. Push the button, run for the exit. Hope you get far enough away before the building comes down. Vernon's smile confirmed the analysis. You always were too smart for your own good. Just smart enough. Pablo. Vernon spun around as Detective Pablo Finley and his SWAT team emerged from concealment, weapons drawn and trained on the desperate fugitive. Drop the detonator, Vernon. It's over. You brought the police? Vernon looked genuinely surprised. I thought this was between us. It stopped being between us when you threatened to kill innocent people. Now drop the device and surrender. Vernon looked around the room, calculating odds, looking for options. The SWAT team had him completely surrounded with no possible escape route. You know what the funny thing is? He said, still holding the detonator. I really did love her. Melissa. Not at first, but eventually. She made me remember what it felt like to want something more than just money and power. Then prove it, Joshua said. Surrender. Don't make her watch the man she cared about die in a pointless last stand. The man she cared about is already dead. Killed by you when you expose what I really was. Vernon looked directly at Joshua, smiled sadly, and pressed the button. Nothing happened. Military demolitions training. Joshua explained as the SWAT team tackled Vernon to the ground. I spent 2 hours this afternoon disarming your explosives. Pretty good work for an amateur, but you used commercial-grade materials with standard timers. Child's play for someone who's defused actual terrorist bombs. As they handcuffed Vernon and read him his rights, he looked up at Joshua with something that might have been respect. You won, he said simply. We all lost, Joshua replied. The only question is whether we can salvage something from the wreckage. Chapter 7. Rebuilding from Ashes. 3 months later, Joshua sat in his office reading the final report on Vernon Farrell's trial. Guilty on all counts: fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, desecration of human remains, and attempted murder. The judge had sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison, ensuring that he would never again destroy another family. The victory felt hollow. His business had survived the scandal, even thrived as clients appreciated his personal experience dealing with sophisticated threats. The media attention had actually increased demand for his security consulting services. Financially, he was better off than he'd been before Vernon entered their lives. But the real damage wasn't financial, it was personal. Melissa knocked on his office door, entering hesitantly when he gestured her inside. They'd been living separately since the trial ended, both needing space to process the trauma and betrayal of the past year. How are you doing? She asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. Better than I expected. Worse than I'd hoped. You? About the same. She was quiet for a moment, studying her hands. I've been seeing Dr. Schwartz twice a week. Working through everything that happened, trying to understand how I let myself be so completely manipulated. Dr. Susie Schwartz was a therapist who specialized in helping victims of psychological manipulation recover their sense of reality and self-worth. She'd been working with all of Vernon's previous targets, helping them understand that they weren't weak or stupid, just human beings who'd encountered a master predator. What does she say? That Vernon spent months studying me, learning my vulnerabilities, crafting a perfect psychological profile of what I needed to hear. Every word, every gesture, every moment of seeming spontaneity was calculated to make me feel like I was making my own choices while actually following a script. Joshua nodded. He'd read the FBI's psychological evaluation of Vernon, which painted a picture of a brilliant sociopath with an instinctive understanding of human weakness. The man was essentially a human algorithm designed to exploit emotional vulnerabilities. Does that make it easier to forgive yourself? A little. But understanding why I did something doesn't erase the fact that I did it. I betrayed you. I betrayed our marriage, and I almost helped him destroy everything you'd built." Her voice caught slightly. "I have to live with that. We both made mistakes. I was so focused on providing security and stability that I forgot to provide emotional intimacy. I treated our marriage like a military operation instead of a relationship between two people who loved each other. You were protecting us, providing for us, being responsible. Those aren't crimes. They're not crimes, but they're not enough either. A marriage needs more than just security and financial stability. It needs connection, romance, spontaneity, all the things I was too rigid to provide." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Two people who'd been through hell together and were trying to find their way back to each other. Dr. Schwartz says that trauma can either destroy a relationship or make it stronger, Melissa said finally. It depends on whether both people are willing to do the work to rebuild trust and intimacy. Are you willing? I want to be, but I don't know if you can ever really forgive me or trust me again. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness after what I put you through. Joshua got up from his desk and moved to the window, looking out at the city where he'd built his business and his life. A year ago, everything had seemed secure, predictable, under control. Now he understood how fragile those illusions had been. "I've been thinking about what Vernon said that night in the warehouse. About me killing people in the military, about the moral differences between his violence and mine." "Josh, you can't compare. Let me finish. He was right that I've killed people. And some of those people might have been decent human beings who were just fighting for their country or their beliefs, same as I was. War makes killers of everyone involved. That's completely different from what Vernon did. Is it? I destroyed lives in service of what I believed was a greater good. Vernon destroyed lives in service of his personal desires. Both of us use violence and deception to achieve our objectives. The only difference is that society approved of my violence." Melissa stood up and moved beside him at the window. "The difference is that you protected innocent people. Vernon preyed on them. You served something larger than yourself. He served only himself. You carried the weight of what you had to do. He enjoyed it. Maybe, or maybe I'm just better at justifying my actions. Josh, you're a good man. A flawed man, like all of us, but fundamentally decent and moral. Vernon was a predator who felt no empathy for his victims. Don't let his manipulations make you doubt who you are." He turned to look at her, really look at her for the first time in months. She looked older, more serious, marked by the trauma they both endured. But there was something else there too, a depth and strength that hadn't been there before. "Dr. Schwartz says I need to stop defining myself by my worst decision," Melissa continued. "That I'm more than just the woman who had an affair. I'm also the woman who chose to help expose Vernon when I learned the truth. The woman who testified against him in court. The woman who's doing the hard work to understand herself and become better. And what do you want to be now? I want to be your wife again, if you'll have me. Not the naive woman who was vulnerable to manipulation, but someone stronger, more aware, more committed to the hard work of maintaining a real relationship." Joshua reached out and took her hand, the same hand that had once worn a fake wedding ring on a dead man's finger, the same hand that had signed fake medical documents, the same hand that had betrayed everything they built together. "It won't be easy. Rebuilding trust, learning to be vulnerable with each other again, dealing with the public scrutiny and media attention. I know, but I think we're both stronger than we were before. We've seen what happens when a marriage becomes complacent, when two people stop really seeing each other. Maybe we can use that knowledge to build something better. Dr. Schwartz is helping you." "Who's helping me?" Melissa smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in months. "I was hoping we could help each other." That evening, they went to dinner at a small restaurant across town, somewhere they'd never been together before. A place with no memories of their previous life, where they could start creating new ones. Over pasta and wine, they talked about everything they'd been through, the betrayal, the investigation, the trial, the media circus that had followed. But more importantly, they talked about what they'd learned about themselves and each other. "I realize now that I married you partly because you felt safe," Melissa admitted. "You were strong, successful, protective, everything my father wasn't. But somewhere along the way, safe became boring, predictable, And I married you partly because you represented everything I'd been fighting to protect, Joshua replied. Home, family, innocence, beauty. But I forgot that you were a real person with your own needs and desires, not just a symbol of the life I wanted to build. So where does that leave us? Starting over, not as the people we were before, but as the people we've become because of what we've been through. They talked until the restaurant closed, then walked through the city streets hand in hand, two survivors of a war they'd never expected to fight. There's something else, Melissa said as they reached their car. Dr. Schwartz wants to meet with both of us together. Couples therapy, to help us navigate rebuilding our relationship. Are you ready for that? I'm ready to try. The question is whether you're ready to forgive me enough to do the work. Joshua stopped walking and turned to face her. I forgave you the moment I realized you'd been manipulated by a professional predator. The question isn't whether I can forgive you. It's whether we can build something new from the pieces of what we lost. And I think we can. I think we have to. Because the alternative is letting Vernon win, even from prison. They kissed then, on a quiet street corner under the city lights. Two people who'd lost everything and found each other again in the wreckage. Chapter 8. The New Foundation. 6 months into their reconciliation, Joshua and Melissa were learning that rebuilding a marriage was harder than starting one from scratch. Every conversation carried the weight of their history. Every gesture had to be evaluated for sincerity. Every disagreement triggered fears about the stability of their renewed commitment. But they were making progress. Dr. Schwartz says we're in the hypervigilance phase, Melissa explained over breakfast. We're both so afraid of making the same mistakes that we're overanalyzing every interaction. Is that normal? Apparently. The goal is to eventually get to a place where we can trust our instincts again, where every conversation doesn't feel like a test. Joshua's phone buzzed with a text from Pablo. Need to see you. Important development in the Farrell case. They met at Murphy's Diner, their usual spot for sensitive conversations. Pablo looked troubled, which was never a good sign. Vernon's been communicating with someone on the outside, he said without preamble. Prison officials intercepted some coded messages that suggest he's trying to coordinate some kind of operation. What kind of operation? We're not sure yet, but the person he's been writing to is Shauna Valencia, the sister of one of his previous victims in Phoenix. Sarah Kemp, the woman who killed herself after Vernon destroyed her marriage. Joshua felt ice forming in his chest. She blames me for Vernon's conviction. Gets worse. Shauna's been researching you, Melissa, your business, your daily routines. She's also been in contact with other family members of Vernon's victims, people who think he was wrongly convicted, that he was just a man in love who got caught up in a vindictive ex-husband's revenge plot. They think I framed him. Vernon's been very persuasive from prison. He's painted himself as the victim of a military-industrial conspiracy, claimed you used your government connections to manufacture evidence against him. Some people are buying it. The irony was staggering. Vernon was still manipulating people, even from behind bars, turning his own victims' families against the man who'd exposed him. How dangerous is this Shauna Valencia? Unknown. No criminal record, but she's been making threats on social media about justice for Vernon and exposing the truth about Joshua Horn. We're watching her, but she hasn't done anything illegal yet. Joshua thanked Pablo and drove home, his mind already shifting into threat assessment mode. Vernon's reach was longer than they'd realized, his ability to manipulate people undiminished by incarceration. That evening, he sat down with Melissa to explain the situation. So even in prison, he's still trying to hurt us, she said quietly. It's what he does. He finds people's vulnerabilities and exploits them. The families of his previous victims are vulnerable because they're grieving, looking for someone to blame. What do? We stay alert. We vary our routines. We trust our instincts if something feels wrong. He took her hand, and we don't let fear control our lives. That would be letting him win. 2 weeks later, the threat materialized in an unexpected way. Joshua was leaving his office late on a Thursday evening when a woman approached him in the parking garage. She was attractive, well-dressed, and looked familiar in a way that triggered his combat instincts. Mr. Horn? I'm Shauna Valencia. I think we need to talk. Joshua's hand instinctively moved toward his concealed weapon, but Shauna raised both hands to show they were empty. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because I think we've both been lied to. By whom? By Vernon Farrell, among others. She looked nothing like what Joshua had expected based on Pablo's briefings. Instead of an angry, grieving sister seeking revenge, she appeared calm, intelligent, and genuinely troubled. You've been investigating Vernon's claims about me, he said. I have, and what I found doesn't match what he told me. She pulled out a tablet and showed him a screen filled with documents. Vernon said you manufactured evidence against him, that you used government connections to frame him for crimes he didn't commit. And the evidence is real. All of it. The DNA tests, the financial records, the testimony from previous victims. It's all genuine. Vernon Farrell really did destroy my sister's marriage, really did steal her assets, and really did abandon her when she had nothing left to take. Joshua studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What he saw instead was a woman grappling with painful truths about someone she trusted. Then why are you here? Because I need to understand something. Vernon claims he loved your wife, that what happened between them was real, not part of his usual pattern. Is that possible? The question caught Joshua off guard. In all his analysis of Vernon's motivations, he'd never seriously considered whether the man might have developed genuine feelings for Melissa. What difference would it make? It would mean he's capable of real emotion, that he's not just a sociopath who sees people as objects to be used. Why does that matter to you? Shauna's composure finally cracked, revealing the pain underneath. Because if he's capable of love, then what he did to my sister was a choice, not a compulsion. It means he could have stopped, could have chosen differently, but he didn't care enough about the damage he was causing. Joshua understood now. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking closure, trying to make sense of her sister's death. I think Vernon did develop feelings for Melissa, he said carefully. But that didn't change his fundamental nature. He still lied to her, still manipulated her, still planned to abandon her once he'd achieved his financial objectives. How can you be sure? Because when I confronted him, when he thought he was about to die, he told me the truth. Melissa was supposed to be practiced for bigger targets. He kept her because she had qualities he valued, but she was still just a possession to him. Something to be owned, not cherished. Shauna nodded slowly. That's what I was afraid of. Sarah thought she'd found someone who truly saw her, who valued her for who she was. But she was just another mark. Your sister wasn't stupid or weak. Vernon is a professional manipulator. What happened to her could have happened to anyone. Thank you for that. And thank you for stopping him before he could destroy more families. As Shauna walked away, Joshua realized that Vernon's manipulation had extended even to this conversation. The man had probably anticipated that his victims' families would eventually investigate his claims, had probably counted on someone like Shauna seeking out the truth and ultimately validating Joshua's actions. Even his failures were calculated to achieve secondary objectives. That night, Joshua shared the encounter with Melissa during their evening therapy session with Dr. Schwartz. It sounds like you handled that very well, the therapist observed. You recognized a potential threat, stayed alert to danger, but remained open to the possibility that she was genuinely seeking understanding. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, Melissa admitted. For Vernon to find some new way to hurt us from prison. That hypervigilance we discussed, Dr. Schwartz said. It's normal after trauma, but it can become its own prison if you let it control your lives. So how do we move past it? By choosing to trust despite the risks. By building something positive instead of just defending against potential threats. After the session, Joshua and Melissa walked through the park where Vernon had once tried to manipulate him into surrendering his marriage. I've been thinking about what Dr. Schwartz said, Melissa said, about building something positive. What did you have in mind? I want to help other women who've been manipulated by predators like Vernon. Maybe volunteer with victim services or speak at support groups. That could be re-traumatizing for you. Or it could be healing. Taking something terrible that happened to me and using it to help others avoid the same fate. Joshua considered this. His own recovery from combat trauma had been helped by working with other veterans, sharing experiences and coping strategies. What would that look like? I don't know yet, but I think there's value in letting women know that being manipulated doesn't make you weak or stupid. That predators like Vernon are skilled professionals who can fool almost anyone. And what about us? Our marriage. I think helping other people might actually strengthen what we're building. Give us a shared purpose beyond just repairing our own damage. That night, for the first time since their reconciliation began, they made love without hesitation, without the weight of the past overwhelming the possibility of the future. Afterwards, lying in each other's arms, Melissa voiced what they were both thinking. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" "Better than okay," Joshua replied. "We're going to be stronger than we ever were before." Outside their bedroom window, the city lights twinkled like stars, illuminating a world full of both predators and protectors, victims and survivors, endings and new beginnings. Chapter 9. Victory and New Beginnings. 1 year later, Joshua stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Domestic Abuse and Psychological Manipulation. In the audience sat law enforcement officials, social workers, therapists, and survivors, people who understood that emotional violence could be just as devastating as physical assault. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you about a predator you might not recognize," he began. Vernon Farrell never raised a hand against his victims. He never threatened them directly. By most legal definitions, he wasn't even a criminal until we caught him desecrating his son's corpse and committing identity fraud. The audience was silent, attentive. But in the span of 10 years, Vernon destroyed 8 marriages, drove 2 people to suicide, caused 3 nervous breakdowns, and stole over $4 million in assets. He was a weapon of mass destruction disguised as a charming businessman. Joshua clicked to the next slide, showing Vernon's photograph alongside images of his victims. The reason he was so successful wasn't because his targets were weak or naive. It was because he understood something that most of us don't want to acknowledge. Every person alive has vulnerabilities that can be exploited by someone with enough skill and patience. In the front row, Melissa watched her husband with pride and admiration. Over the past year, they'd rebuilt their marriage into something stronger and more honest than it had ever been before. But more than that, they found a shared mission in helping other people recognize and resist psychological manipulation. "My wife Melissa will tell you that she's not a weak woman," Joshua continued. "She's intelligent, educated, successful in her own career." But Vernon spent months studying her, learning her insecurities, crafting a perfect psychological profile designed to make her question her marriage and seek comfort in his arms. Melissa stood up at his gesture, addressing the audience. "I want you to understand something," she said. "When I met Vernon Farrell, I didn't think I was vulnerable to manipulation. I thought I could recognize a con artist. But Vernon didn't present himself as a con artist. He presented himself as everything I didn't realize I was missing in my marriage." Her voice carried the hard-earned wisdom of someone who'd survived hell and chosen to help others avoid the same fate. "He made me feel seen, appreciated, understood. He listened to my complaints about my husband with perfect empathy. He validated every frustration, every doubt, every moment of loneliness I'd ever felt. And slowly, gradually, he convinced me that those feelings meant my marriage was fundamentally broken." She paused, looking directly at Joshua. "What I didn't realize was that every marriage has moments of disconnection. Every person has insecurities and unmet needs. Vernon didn't create my vulnerabilities. He just found them and exploited them with surgical precision." After their presentation, they were approached by dozens of people, law enforcement officials who'd encountered similar cases, therapists working with manipulation victims, survivors who recognized their own stories in what they'd shared. One woman, elderly with kind eyes, introduced herself as Dr. Martha Taylor, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating sociopathic behavior. "What you've described is textbook predatory manipulation," she told them. "But what interests me is how you turn the tables on him. Most victims never recover their agency once they've been targeted by someone of Vernon's caliber. I had advantages," Joshua explained. "Military training in psychological operations, experience recognizing deception and manipulation. I knew what I was dealing with. That's part of it. But I think there's something else. You chose to see your wife as a fellow victim rather than an enemy. That's remarkable, Because most spouses in your situation focus their anger on the unfaithful partner rather than the manipulator. I was angry, Joshua admitted, but I recognized that she'd been professionally manipulated by an expert. Blaming her for falling victim to Vernon would be like blaming someone for being robbed by a master pickpocket. Dr. Taylor nodded approvingly. That's the key insight that most people miss. Predators like Vernon are skilled professionals. Their victims aren't stupid or weak. They're just human beings who encountered someone whose entire life was devoted to exploiting human psychology. That evening, Joshua and Melissa sat in their hotel room, reviewing emails from conference attendees. Law enforcement agencies wanted them to consult on similar cases. Victim services organizations wanted them to develop training programs. Publishers wanted them to write a book about their experience. Hard to believe how much good has come from something so terrible, Melissa observed. Vernon would probably be furious if he knew. His attempt to destroy our lives has turned into a platform for helping other people. Have you heard anything from Pablo about his appeals? All denied. The evidence was too overwhelming and his pattern of behavior too clear. He'll serve at least 20 years before he's eligible for parole. Melissa was quiet for a moment. Do you ever feel sorry for him? Joshua considered the question seriously. Sometimes. He's clearly a damaged person who never learned to form genuine human connections. But then I think about Tyler, his own son, and how he used that boy's death as a weapon. Whatever trauma made Vernon into what he is, it doesn't excuse the choices he made. Dr. Schwartz says that understanding our enemies doesn't mean forgiving them. Smart woman. That's probably why our marriage survived. They were interrupted by a knock on the door. Joshua checked the peephole and saw Pablo Finley standing in the hallway. Pablo, what are you doing here? Had to fly out for a conference anyway. Thought I'd stop by and see how your presentation went. He looked tired but satisfied. Also wanted to give you some news about Vernon. What kind of news? The kind you're going to like. One of his cellmates got tired of listening to him brag about manipulating women and decided to teach him some humility. Vernon's in the prison hospital with a broken jaw and 3 cracked ribs. Joshua felt no satisfaction in the news. Violence, even against someone like Vernon, wasn't justice. It was just more violence. Is he going to be okay? He'll recover. But apparently word has gotten around the prison about what he did to his victims. Child predators and guys who hurt women don't do well in general population. Maybe they'll move him to protective custody. Maybe. But here's the interesting part. The warden says Vernon's been different since the attack. Quieter. Less arrogant. Like maybe he's finally understanding that actions have consequences. After Pablo left, Joshua and Melissa sat together on the hotel balcony, looking out over the city lights. Do you think people like Vernon can change? Melissa asked. I don't know, but I know that people like us can. We've proven that trauma doesn't have to define us, that betrayal doesn't have to destroy us, that even the worst experiences can become the foundation for something better. When we first started therapy, I thought the goal was to get back to where we were before Vernon entered our lives. And now I realize that where we were before wasn't good enough. We were complacent, disconnected, taking each other for granted. What we have now is better, harder earned, but more real. Joshua pulled her closer, marveling at how much they both changed. The woman beside him wasn't the naive, suburban wife who'd been vulnerable to Vernon's manipulation. She was a survivor, a warrior, someone who'd been through hell and chosen to help others avoid the same fate. I love you, he said simply. I love you too. Not the way I loved you before, but something deeper, something tested. Below them, the city continued its eternal dance of light and shadow, predators and prey, victims and survivors. Somewhere in a federal prison, Vernon Farrell was learning that even master manipulators eventually face consequences for their actions. Somewhere else, other predators were stalking new victims, and other couples were struggling to recognize the threats to their happiness. But here, in this moment, Joshua and Melissa Horn had found something that Vernon could never touch or understand, a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than before. The war was over. They had won, and their victory felt earned. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Ghost Returns. Greg Hull adjusted his black tie in the rearview mirror of his rental car, staring at the weathered face that looked back at him. For years of sleeping in shelters, eating at soup kitchens, and working odd jobs had carved deep lines around his steel-gray eyes. But beneath the surface of apparent defeat, something darker burned, a patience that had been forged in the crucible of absolute loss. The funeral home parking lot was packed with expensive cars, a stark reminder of the wealth he'd once known. Greg had grown up in the Hull family mansion, heir to a construction empire built by 3 generations of Hull men. His father, Harold Hull, had been a titan in the industry, owning everything from concrete plants to luxury resort developments across 3 states. Greg had worked alongside him since he was 16, learning every aspect of the business, earning his place as the natural successor. That was before his brother Chad had poisoned everything. Chad Hull had always been the charming one, quick with a smile, faster with a lie. While Greg buried himself in blueprints and construction schedules, Chad had focused on networking and politics. He'd married early to a senator's daughter, giving him connections Greg never thought to cultivate. When their mother died 10 years ago, Chad had started working on their father, planting seeds of doubt about Greg's instability and drinking problem, lies that grew into accepted truth through constant repetition. But the killing blow had come from the woman Greg had loved more than life itself. Lynette Hendricks had been Greg's college sweetheart, a psychology major with honey blonde hair and a laugh that could light up a room. They'd been together for 8 years, married for 5, and Greg had never doubted her loyalty. She knew about the family tensions, had even defended Greg against Chad's subtle manipulations. Or so he'd thought. The day Greg discovered the truth still burned in his memory like acid. He'd come home early from a job site, wanting to surprise Lynette for their anniversary. Instead, he'd found her in their bed with Chad, moving together with the familiarity of longtime lovers. The confrontation that followed had been volcanic. Accusations, admissions, and the revelation that they'd been together for 2 years. "I never loved you," Lynette had said, her voice cold as winter steel. "You were just a placeholder until Chad was ready to leave his wife. You're weak, Greg. You always have been. Chad knows how to take what he wants." The divorce had been swift and brutal, with Chad's legal connections and Lynette's accusations of domestic violence. Lies, but convincing ones. Greg had lost everything. The family business went to Chad as Harold chose his stable son over his violent one. The house, the cars, the investments, all gone. Within 6 months, Greg Hull had been transformed from millionaire heir to homeless vagrant. Now, standing outside the funeral home where his father's body lay in state, Greg felt no grief, only the cold satisfaction of knowing his time for justice had finally arrived. He walked through the parking lot, noting the familiar faces through expensive car windows. Local politicians, business partners, society wives, all the people who had turned their backs on him when his fall from grace became public knowledge. They would all be inside, paying their respects to Harold Hull while carefully avoiding eye contact with his disgraced son. The funeral home's lobby was exactly as Greg remembered from his mother's service. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the cloying scent of too many flowers. He signed the guest book with steady hands, aware of the whispers that followed his movement through the crowd. "Is that really Greg Hull? I heard he's been living on the streets. Such a shame what happened to that family." Greg found his father's casket surrounded by elaborate floral arrangements, most bearing cards from Chad's business associates. Harold Hull looked smaller in death, his weathered hands folded over his chest. Greg felt nothing as he stared down at the man who had chosen Chad's lies over his own son's truth. Well, look what the cat dragged in." Greg turned to see Chad approaching, looking every inch the successful businessman in his $1,000 suit. At 38, Chad had maintained his college quarterback physique, though his face had gained the soft smugness that came with unearned success. Behind him walked Lynette, now carrying the whole name she'd schemed to claim. She'd barely changed, still beautiful, still cold, still wearing that calculating look Greg now recognized as her true nature. "Hello, Chad." "Lynette." Greg's voice was steady, betraying none of the rage that simmered beneath the surface. Chad's grin was all teeth and malice. "Still homeless and divorced?" "LMAO." He actually said the acronym out loud, as if Greg's suffering was nothing more than an internet joke. Lynette stepped closer, her perfume a cloying reminder of their shared past. "Hey, useless child," she said, using the pet name she'd once claimed was affectionate. "Still the same pathetic loser, I see." The crowd around them had gone quiet, sensing drama. Greg could feel dozens of eyes watching, waiting for him to break, to give them the spectacle they'd come to expect from the fallen Hull brother. Instead, Greg smiled. Before he could respond, a distinguished voice cut through the tension. "Perfect timing. I have something important to tell you." Matthew Jackson, the Hull family lawyer for 30 years, had appeared beside them with a manila envelope in his weathered hands. The elderly attorney's face was grave as he looked between the three of them. "Perhaps we should step into the private viewing room," Jackson continued. "What I have to say concerns the reading of Harold's will, and I believe it requires immediate attention." Greg watched Chad's face shift from smugness to confusion, while Lynette's eyes narrowed with the sharp calculation he remembered so well. They thought they knew what was coming. Another humiliation for Greg, another victory for their twisted partnership. They had no idea that Greg Hull had spent 4 years planning for this exact moment. Chapter 2. The Foundation of Betrayal. 5 years earlier, Greg Hull had been living what most people would consider a perfect life. As vice president of Hull Construction, he managed a company worth over $50 million, overseeing projects from luxury condominiums to government infrastructure contracts. His marriage to Lynette seemed solid, built on 8 years of shared history and mutual ambition. They lived in a sprawling estate in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, hosted dinner parties for business associates, and talked about starting a family. Greg had been naive enough to believe it was real. The first crack in his perfect world had come during a family dinner at the Hull mansion. Chad had been discussing his divorce from Senator Morrison's daughter, Patricia, claiming irreconcilable differences. Greg had offered his support, even suggesting Chad move into their guest house until he found his own place. "That's generous of you, brother," Chad had said with what Greg now recognized as calculated sincerity. "But I think I need to be completely independent. Fresh start and all that." Harold had nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking, son. A man needs to stand on his own 2 feet. Greg had noticed how his father used son when addressing Chad, while he himself rarely received more than a grunt of acknowledgement. It had stung, but Greg had attributed it to Chad's recent emotional trauma. That same evening, Lynette had been unusually quiet during the drive home. When Greg asked if something was wrong, she'd turned to him with an expression he'd never seen before, something calculating and cold. "Do you ever wonder if you're living the right life?" she'd asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you sure you're with the right person? In a right family position? Sometimes I think people settle for what's comfortable instead of fighting for what they really want." Greg had laughed, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "I've got everything I want right here." But Lynette had pulled her hand away, staring out the window with that distant look that would become increasingly familiar over the following months. The betrayal had been methodical and thorough. While Greg focused on running the day-to-day operations of Hull Construction, Chad worked on their father's perception of reality. Family dinners became opportunities for Chad to subtly undermine Greg's decisions, questioning his judgment on projects and highlighting every minor setback as evidence of deeper problems. "I'm worried about Greg, Dad," Chad would say with feigned concern. "He's been making some questionable calls lately." The Morrison project was 3 weeks behind schedule because of his miscalculations. It was weather delays, Greg would protest, but Harold's trust had already begun to erode. Meanwhile, Lynette had become increasingly distant, claiming work stress and scheduling conflicts that kept her away from home. Greg had been concerned enough to suggest marriage counseling, but she dismissed the idea with a laugh. "Not everything needs to be fixed, Greg. Sometimes people just grow apart." The lies had been everywhere, but Greg had been too trusting to see them. Chad would show up at their house when Greg was at work, ostensibly to borrow tools or check on Lynette after Greg mentioned she'd been feeling unwell. Lynette would return from girls' nights, smelling like cologne that wasn't Greg's, with explanations that made perfect sense individually, but formed a disturbing pattern when examined together. The business had suffered as Greg became increasingly distracted by his crumbling personal life. A missed deadline here, a cost overrun there. Nothing catastrophic, but enough for Chad to build a case that Greg was becoming unreliable. Harold had started calling Chad directly about projects, bypassing Greg entirely. "I think you need a vacation," Harold had said during what would be their last private conversation. "Chad can handle things for a few weeks while you get your head on straight." Greg had protested, but Harold's mind was made up. The old man's eyes held a disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. The final revelation had come on a Tuesday afternoon in spring. Greg had left work early, driving home with flowers and champagne to surprise Lynette for their 5th wedding anniversary. The house had been quiet when he'd entered, but he'd heard sound from upstairs, soft voices and movement from their bedroom. The door had been partially open, giving him a perfect view of his wife and brother moving together with practiced intimacy. They weren't just having sex. They were making love with the familiarity of a long-established couple. Watching them, Greg had realized this wasn't a recent affair. It was a relationship that had been growing for months, possibly years. The confrontation had been brutal. Chad had been arrogant, claiming he'd won the better woman, while Lynette had been viciously honest about her true feelings. "You were always the placeholder," she'd said, pulling on Chad's shirt with casual intimacy. "The safe choice while I figured out what I really wanted. Chad has ambition, connections, vision. You're just a worker bee who inherited a crown you never deserved." The divorce proceedings had been swift and merciless. Chad's political connections had provided Lynette with a lawyer who specialized in high-stakes family court cases. Her claims of emotional and physical abuse, all lies, but convincingly delivered, had swayed a judge who seemed predisposed to believe the beautiful victim over the angry husband. Harold had refused to support Greg publicly, claiming he didn't want to take sides in family matters. But privately, he made his choice clear by promoting Chad to president of Hull Construction and removing Greg from all decision-making authority. "You're not thinking clearly," Harold had said during their final argument. "A man who can't control his own household can't be trusted to run a business." Within 6 months, Greg had lost everything: his wife, his family business, his home, and his father's respect. Chad and Lynette had married in a lavish ceremony at the country club where Greg had once been a member. The guest list had included everyone from Greg's former life, all celebrating the triumph of the golden couple over the fallen prince. But what they didn't know was that Greg Hull had inherited more than just a construction company from 3 generations of Hull men. He'd inherited their patience, their ability to plan, and their absolute ruthlessness when dealing with enemies. Over the past 4 years, while living in shelters and working menial jobs, Greg had been planning something that would make his brother and ex-wife understand the true meaning of loss. Chapter 3: The Reading of Vengeance. The private viewing room felt like a courtroom as Matthew Jackson arranged his papers on the mahogany table. Chad sat with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, while Lynette maintained the composed mask she perfected over 4 years of high society marriage. Greg remained standing by the window, appearing calm despite the hurricane of anticipation building in his chest. "Before we begin," Jackson said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I should note that Harold made several significant changes to his will in the weeks before his death. These modifications were made with full legal capacity and proper witnesses." Chad leaned forward. "What kind of changes, Matthew?" "Nothing too dramatic, I hope." The lawyer's expression remained neutral. "I'll read the relevant sections verbatim, as Harold requested." He opened the official document, cleared his throat, and began. "To my son Chad Hull, who has spent the past 4 years believing himself to be my heir and successor, I leave the sum of $100,000 and my collection of fishing equipment. This bequest comes with my recognition of his success in deceiving an old man who should have been wiser. Chad's face went white. What the hell does that mean? Jackson continued reading. To Lynette Hull, née Hendricks, who married into my family through lies and manipulation, I leave nothing. She has already taken more than her share. Lynette shot to her feet. This is impossible. Harold loved me like a daughter. I was the only one who visited him regularly in his final months. Please sit down, Mrs. Hull, Jackson said firmly. There's more. Greg felt his pulse quicken as the lawyer turned to the next page. To my son, Greg Hull, who I wronged through my own blindness and pride, I leave my sincere apology and the entirety of my estate, including all business holdings, properties, and investments, valued at approximately $68 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Chad's mouth moved soundlessly while Lynette gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles white. Furthermore, Jackson continued, I direct my executor to inform Greg that the safety deposit box at First National Bank contains materials that will be of great interest to him. The contents were compiled with the assistance of private investigator Raphael Owen, whom I hired after discovering certain discrepancies in information I had been given about my sons. Chad finally found his voice. This is insane. The old man was clearly suffering from dementia. We'll contest this will so fast, it'll make your head spin. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Jackson replied calmly. Harold underwent comprehensive psychological evaluation just 2 weeks before his death. Dr. Amanda Chung declared him to be of completely sound mind and judgment. Her report is part of the official file. Greg spoke for the first time since entering the room. Tell them about the investigation, Matthew. The lawyer nodded grimly. Harold hired Raphael Owen 18 months ago after becoming suspicious about certain claims made regarding Greg's character and behavior. Owen's report makes for fascinating reading. He pulled out a thick folder and opened it to the first page. For instance, the domestic violence claims made during the divorce proceedings were thoroughly debunked. Owen interviewed 3 witnesses who were present during the alleged incidents. All confirmed they never occurred. Lynette's face had gone pale. You can't prove anything. Those were sealed court records. Owen is very thorough, Jackson continued. He also documented the affair between Chad and Lynette, which began approximately 18 months before Greg discovered it. Hotel records, credit card statements, witness testimonies, quite comprehensive. Chad stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. So what? We're all adults here. People fall in love. True, Greg said, finally turning from the window. But corporate fraud is a different matter entirely. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Chad's swagger cracked slightly. What fraud? I've never. Sit down, Chad. Greg's voice carried an authority that made his brother comply instinctively. Let Matthew finish reading. Jackson turned to another section of the report. Owen discovered that Chad had been systematically overbilling clients and skimming profits for nearly 3 years. The money was hidden in offshore accounts established under false names. The total amount appears to be just over $4 million. That's impossible, Chad protested, but his voice lacked conviction. The evidence includes bank records, forged invoices, and testimony from 3 employees who were aware of the scheme but afraid to come forward, Jackson continued. One of them, Stuart Gleason from the accounting department, kept detailed records as insurance against being blamed himself. Lynette was staring at Chad with growing horror. You told me that money came from successful investments. It did come from investments, Chad said desperately. I invested in the company's future by stealing from it, Greg interrupted. By betraying everything our grandfather and father built. By proving that you're exactly the parasite I always suspected you were. Chad lunged toward Greg, but stopped when the door opened to admit 2 men in suits. Gentlemen, Jackson announced, meet Detectives Wayne Farley and Aaron Stevens from the Financial Crimes Division. They've been very interested in Mr. Owen's findings. Detective Farley stepped forward with handcuffs visible on his belt. Chad Hull, you're under arrest for embezzlement, corporate fraud, and tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda warning continued, Chad's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally, desperate terror. Lynette backed against the wall, her perfectly composed mask finally cracking to reveal the calculating opportunist beneath. "This isn't over," Chad snarled as the handcuffs clicked shut. "I'll fight this. I'll prove you set me up." Greg smiled for the first time in 4 years, a cold, predatory expression that made everyone in the room take a step back. "Oh, brother," he said softly, "we're just getting started." As the detectives led Chad away, Lynette turned to Greg with something approaching her old seductive smile. "Greg, honey, you have to understand, I was trapped. Chad threatened me, controlled me. I never wanted to hurt you." Greg looked at her for a long moment, remembering the woman he'd once loved enough to forgive anything. Then he thought about 4 years of sleeping in shelters while she lived in luxury, built on stolen money and lies. "Lynette," he said gently, "in about 30 minutes, you're going to receive a visit from the IRS. Turns out when you file joint tax returns with someone who's hiding millions in offshore accounts, you become liable for the unpaid taxes. The penalties and interest should wipe out whatever assets you might have claimed in the divorce." Her mask finally shattered completely. "You bastard. You planned this whole thing." "I planned nothing," Greg replied. "I simply waited for the truth to surface, then made sure it reached the right people." "Justice isn't revenge, Lynette. It's just accounting." As she stormed out, Greg turned back to Matthew Jackson, who was organizing his papers with the satisfaction of a job well done. "There's one more thing, Greg," the lawyer said. "Your father left you a personal letter. He wanted you to read it alone." Greg took the sealed envelope with hands that barely trembled. After 4 years of careful planning and patient waiting, Harold Hull would finally have the last word. Chapter 4. The Letter and the Plan. Greg waited until he was completely alone in his hotel room before opening his father's letter. The envelope bore Harold's distinctive handwriting, still strong despite his 73 years. Inside, 3 pages of thick stationery carried words that Greg had waited 4 years to hear. "My son Greg, if you're reading this, then justice has finally been served, though far too late for my liking. I have no excuse for the blindness that allowed me to believe Chad's lies and doubt your character. A man my age should have been wiser, but perhaps the heart always wants to believe the more pleasant lie over the harder truth. Raphael Owen's investigation opened my eyes to the depth of Chad's deception and your innocence in all matters. The domestic violence claims were fabricated, the business failures were sabotaged, and your supposed drinking problem was a complete fiction. I failed you as a father by choosing to believe the son who told me what I wanted to hear over the son who showed me who he really was through his actions. But this letter is not just an apology, it's a roadmap. Owen's investigation uncovered far more than just Chad's corporate theft. I've spent the last 18 months documenting every lie, every manipulation, every crime committed against you and our family legacy. The safety deposit box contains evidence of additional schemes that go far beyond simple embezzlement. Chad has been using Hull Construction as a front for money laundering operations tied to his political connections. The Riverside Casino project was funded with dirty money from Pablo Pollard's organization, filtered through shell companies Chad established. The city contracts were secured through bribes paid to Councilman Terry McKee and Planning Commissioner Hugh Higgins. The entire operation is documented in the files. But Greg, I'm not asking you to simply turn this evidence over to authorities. I'm giving you the tools to destroy them completely, legally, financially, and socially. They took 4 years of your life through lies and manipulation. Take everything from them in return. Your loving father, Harold Hull. P.S. Felix William at the bank has been expecting you. The second safety deposit box contains something else you'll need. Greg set the letter down and walked to the hotel window, staring out at the city where he'd once been a prince and then a pauper. His father's words had lifted a weight he'd carried for 4 years, but they'd also confirmed something he'd suspected. Chad's crimes went far beyond simple theft. The next morning, Greg visited First National Bank. Felix William, a veteran banker with silver hair and knowing eyes, led him to the safety deposit boxes without small talk. The first box contained Raphael Owen's complete investigation files, hundreds of pages of evidence, photographs, financial records, and witness statements. The second box contained something that made Greg smile with genuine appreciation for his father's thorough planning. Cash. Nearly $2 million in untraceable bills, accumulated over 18 months from Harold's personal accounts. Attached was a note for expenses not covered by traditional legal channels. Greg spent the next week studying every document, understanding the full scope of Chad and Lynette's betrayal. The evidence painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached into city government, state politics, and organized crime. Chad hadn't just stolen from the family business. He turned it into a criminal enterprise. More importantly, Greg now understood why Lynette had targeted him so specifically. Her psychology degree hadn't been wasted. She'd been the perfect manipulator to identify his weaknesses and exploit them. The entire affair had been calculated from the beginning, designed to position Chad as the reliable heir while discrediting Greg completely. But Harold's investigation had revealed Lynette's true background as well. Her real name was Linda Henderson, and she'd been married twice before under different identities. Each marriage had ended with her husband losing substantial assets through suspicious circumstances. She was a professional predator who'd found the perfect mark in the Hull family fortune. On the seventh day, Greg made his first move. He called Detective Wayne Farley and arranged a meeting at a discreet coffee shop downtown. Farley arrived looking skeptical until Greg began laying out documents that expanded the embezzlement case into something much larger. Jesus Christ, Farley muttered, studying photographs of Chad meeting with known associates of Pablo Pollard. How long has this been going on? At least 3 years, Greg replied. Probably longer. Hull Construction has been washing money for multiple criminal organizations while also paying bribes for preferential city contracts. The Riverside Casino project alone involved $12 million in dirty money. Farley was a 20-year veteran who'd seen every kind of corruption, but this evidence was overwhelming in its scope and precision. Why come to me? He asked finally. With evidence like this, you could go to the FBI, the state attorney general, anywhere. Greg leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a slight smile. Because you arrested Chad based on my father's evidence. You've already committed to seeing this through. And because I want them to understand exactly how much they've lost before the federal agencies get involved. Over the next 2 weeks, Greg orchestrated a campaign of revelation that unfolded like a carefully planned military operation. Anonymous tips led reporters to offshore banking records. Suspicious activity reports triggered IRS investigations into multiple shell companies. Witness statements from former employees suddenly became public knowledge. Chad's arrest for embezzlement had been shocking enough, but as the web of corruption unraveled, it became clear that Hull Construction had been the center of a criminal conspiracy that touched dozens of public officials and business leaders. Lynette's true identity as Linda Henderson became front-page news when her previous marriage victims came forward with their stories. The beautiful widow who charmed high society was revealed as a serial predator who destroyed multiple families for financial gain. But Greg's masterstroke came when he arranged for Pablo Pollard to learn that Chad had been cooperating with police from the moment of his arrest. It wasn't true. Chad had maintained his innocence throughout, but Pollard didn't know that. The crime boss's organization had a reputation for handling informants with extreme prejudice. Greg made sure Chad learned about Pollard's displeasure while he was still in county jail awaiting federal charges. The fear in his brother's eyes during their first and only jail visit was worth 4 years of patient waiting. You set me up, Chad whispered through the bulletproof glass. You planned this whole thing. I planned nothing, Greg replied calmly. I simply documented your crimes and made sure the right people learned about them. Everything that's happening to you is the direct result of choices you made. Chad's face was gaunt from stress and fear. Pollard's people are going to kill me. Then you'd better hope the federal prosecutor offers you protective custody, Greg said, standing to leave. Of course, that would require admitting to crimes you've spent weeks denying. Wait, Chad called desperately. What about Lynette? What are you going to do to her? Greg paused at the door, considering the question. In truth, Lynette's destruction was already well underway through legal channels. Her assets frozen, her reputation ruined, her true identity exposed. But Chad didn't need to know that his ex-wife's fate was sealed. Lynette made her choice 4 years ago, Greg said finally. She chose you over me because she thought you were the winner. Now she gets to live with the consequences of that choice. As Greg walked away from the jail, he felt the satisfaction of a plan executed to perfection. But this was only the beginning. The evidence he'd inherited from his father contained enough ammunition to destroy not just Chad and Lynette, but the entire network of corruption they'd built around themselves. Justice, Greg reflected, was indeed just accounting, and he intended to balance these books down to the last penny. Chapter 5. The Network Falls. 3 weeks after Chad's arrest, Greg sat in the renovated penthouse office that had once belonged to his father. Hull Construction was officially under federal oversight while the investigation continued, but Greg's inheritance as majority shareholder gave him control over day-to-day operations. His first act had been to hire Amanda Chung, the psychiatrist who'd evaluated his father, as the company's new chief ethics officer. His second had been to schedule individual meetings with every employee who'd remained silent about Chad's crimes. Stuart Gleason arrived first, nervous sweat beading on his forehead despite the building's air conditioning. As the accounting manager who'd documented Chad's embezzlement, Stuart had been living in fear of retaliation for nearly 3 years. "Mr. Hull," Stuart began, "I want you to know I never wanted to be part of—" Greg raised a hand to stop him. "Stuart, you kept detailed records that helped expose my brother's crimes. That took courage, even if you were initially motivated by self-preservation." "I was terrified," Stuart admitted. "Chad threatened to frame me for the thefts if I ever said anything. He had connections everywhere: police, courts, politicians. I didn't think anyone would believe me." "I understand. But now I need you to help me understand something else." Greg pulled out a file folder containing bank records and shell company documentation. "These accounts show money flowing to companies that don't seem to exist. Can you walk me through how Chad was hiding the money laundering operations?" Over the next hour, Stuart detailed a sophisticated network of financial manipulation that went far beyond simple embezzlement. Chad had created a web of shell companies that existed only on paper, each designed to obscure the source and destination of illegal funds. Money from Pablo Pollard's criminal organization would enter through one company, be transferred through 6 others, then emerge as legitimate Hull Construction revenue. The genius of it, Stuart explained reluctantly, was that most of the individual transactions looked normal. A construction company receiving payment from subcontractors, paying suppliers, transferring funds for materials. Only when you mapped the entire network could you see it was all designed to wash dirty money. Greg nodded grimly. His brother had been more clever than he'd given him credit for, but cleverness without conscience was just another form of stupidity. That afternoon, Greg met with Detective Farley and 2 federal agents who'd joined the investigation. Agent Kirsten Levine from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and Agent Eduardo Crow from the DEA had been tracking Pablo Pollard's organization for 3 years without realizing Hull Construction was part of his operation. "Your brother's cooperation has been limited," Agent Levine said diplomatically. "He maintains his innocence despite overwhelming evidence." "Chad always did have trouble accepting responsibility," Greg replied. "But I might be able to help you understand the full scope of the network." He provided them with Harold's complete files, including surveillance photographs of Chad meeting with Pollard's lieutenants, detailed financial records showing money transfers, and copies of coded communications between Hull Construction and various criminal enterprises. "This is incredible," Agent Crow muttered, studying photographs of Chad shaking hands with known drug dealers. "We've been trying to map Pollard's money laundering operation for years. This gives us everything we need." "There's more," Greg said. "The corruption extends into city government. Councilman Terry McKee and Planning Commissioner Hugh Higgins have been taking bribes to fast-track construction permits for projects funded with dirty money." Agent Levine looked up sharply. "Do you have evidence of that?" Greg pulled out audio recordings his father had made during the final months of his life. Harold had suspected the bribes and used his connections to document meetings between Chad and the corrupt officials. The recordings were damning. Chad's voice clearly discussing payments to McKee and Higgins in exchange for expedited permits and zoning variances. The officials' voices equally clear in accepting the arrangements and discussing specific amounts. Jesus, Detective Farley breathed. This is going to bring down half the city government. Only the corrupt half, Greg corrected. The honest officials will remain to rebuild what's been damaged. Within 48 hours, the investigation had expanded to include federal racketeering charges. McKee and Higgins were arrested at their homes in pre-dawn raids, while Hull Construction's offices were searched by teams of federal agents, collecting evidence of the money laundering conspiracy. The local media had a field day. Headlines screamed about corruption at City Hall, organized crime infiltration of legitimate businesses, and the stunning fall of one of the region's most prominent families. Chad's mugshot appeared on the front page of every newspaper, his once confident smile replaced by the hollow stare of a man facing life in federal prison. But Greg's attention was focused on a different target. Lynette had hired Kenneth Herman, one of the city's most expensive criminal defense attorneys, despite claiming poverty in her divorce filings. Greg knew she had to be drawing on hidden assets, money that represented her share of Chad's criminal profits. Through Raphael Owen, who'd remained on Greg's payroll after Harold's death, Greg learned that Lynette was living in a luxury apartment under her real name, Linda Henderson. She'd abandoned the pretense of being Chad's grieving wife and was preparing to disappear entirely once the heat died down. She'd done it before with previous husbands, vanishing with stolen assets while leaving behind devastated families. But this time, she'd underestimated her target. Greg arranged to meet her at the apartment through a carefully orchestrated deception. Owen had contacted her claiming to represent a potential buyer for information about Chad's hidden assets, information that would be valuable to either the government or Pablo Pollard's organization. When Lynette opened the door expecting a corrupt private investigator, she found Greg standing in the hallway with a briefcase and a cold smile. "Hello, Linda," he said, using her real name. "We need to talk." Her mask of composed beauty cracked instantly, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "What do you want?" "Justice," Greg replied, stepping into the apartment uninvited. "And an accounting of everything you've stolen from my family." The apartment was expensively furnished with art and jewelry that couldn't have been purchased on Chad's legitimate salary. Greg recognized several pieces from their former home, items Lynette had claimed in the divorce settlement despite their connection to the whole family heritage. "You can't prove anything," Lynette said, backing toward the bedroom where Greg assumed she kept either weapons or a go-bag for quick escapes. "Actually, I can prove everything." Greg opened the briefcase to reveal copies of financial records linking her to Chad's shell companies. "You weren't just his accomplice, Linda. You were his business partner from the beginning." The documents showed Lynette's real role in the conspiracy. She'd used her psychology background to identify potential corruption targets, manipulating city officials and business leaders into accepting bribes. Her charm and beauty had opened doors that remained closed to Chad's more obvious criminality. "You're going to prison," Greg continued calmly. "The only question is whether you serve your sentence in minimum security or maximum. That depends on how helpful you are to the federal investigators." Lynette's composure finally shattered completely. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," she screamed. "Pablo Pollard doesn't forgive people who cooperate with police. Chad is already marked for death, and anyone who helps bring down his operation will be next. Then you'd better hope the FBI's witness protection program is as good as advertised," Greg replied. "Because your only choice now is between federal prison and a shallow grave." As he left the apartment, Greg felt no satisfaction in Lynette's terror. She'd earned her fate through 4 years of choices that had destroyed innocent people for financial gain. Now she would face the consequences of those choices, just as Chad was learning to face his. But Greg's campaign of justice was far from over. The network of corruption his brother had built reached into organizations and institutions that would take months to unravel. Every thread needed to be followed, every crime documented, every criminal held accountable. The fallen prince was becoming the avenging angel, and his work had only just begun. Chapter 6: The Predator's Web. Raphael Owen's investigation into Lynette's background had uncovered a pattern that stretched back 15 years and crossed multiple state lines. Her real name was Linda Marie Henderson, but she'd operated under at least 6 different identities while systematically destroying the lives of wealthy men who'd made the mistake of trusting her. Greg studied the files in his restored office, each case folder representing a family devastated by Linda's manipulations. Her first victim had been Marcus Webb, a successful restaurant owner in Chicago. She'd married him under the name Lily Watkins, then divorced him after claiming domestic abuse and emptying his business accounts. Webb had committed suicide 6 months after losing everything, leaving behind 3 children who'd been turned against him through Linda's lies. The pattern was always the same. Identify a wealthy target, create a false identity, establish trust through charm and apparent vulnerability, then systematically isolate the victim from family and friends while gaining access to financial assets. The divorce would come with fabricated evidence of abuse, ensuring favorable settlements that left the men with nothing, while Linda disappeared with new identities and substantial wealth. She's not just a gold digger, Amanda Chung observed, reviewing the psychological profiles Raphael had compiled. She's a sociopathic predator who views human beings as resources to be exploited and discarded. Greg nodded grimly. The question is whether we can connect her to all these previous crimes. Most of the evidence is circumstantial, and some of these men are dead. Actually, Raphael said, I found something interesting. Linda made a mistake with her 4th victim, William Cross in Denver. She used the same social security number on 2 different marriage licenses, creating a paper trail that connects multiple identities. The implications were staggering. If they could prove Linda had committed marriage fraud across state lines, she'd face federal charges that could add decades to her sentence for the whole conspiracy crimes. Greg authorized Raphael to expand his investigation, using Harold's remaining cash reserves to dig deeper into Linda's criminal history. What they discovered over the next 2 weeks was even worse than they'd imagined. Linda hadn't just stolen money from her victims. She destroyed their relationships with their children through systematic psychological manipulation. Children were turned against their fathers through carefully planted suggestions of abuse and neglect. Business partnerships were sabotaged through whispered accusations of incompetence and dishonesty. Entire social circles were poisoned against the targets through Linda's masterful manipulation of sympathy and outrage. She's a one-woman hurricane, Raphael reported during their final briefing. Everywhere she goes, families and businesses are destroyed while she walks away richer and ready to start again. But Greg's investigation had revealed something else. Linda had never faced real consequences for her crimes. The men she destroyed had been too broken or too dead to pursue justice. Law enforcement agencies in different states had never connected the cases. She'd operated with impunity for 15 years, leaving a trail of devastation that stretched across the country. That was about to change. Greg arranged a meeting with Agent Levine and Detective Farley, presenting them with Raphael's complete investigation into Linda's criminal history. The evidence showed a clear pattern of interstate fraud, identity theft, and racketeering that gave federal prosecutors everything they needed to file additional charges. This is incredible work, Agent Levine said, studying the case files. We can tie her to at least 8 separate federal crimes across 5 states. She's looking at multiple life sentences even before we factor in her role with the whole conspiracy. There's something else, Greg said. She's been using the money from these crimes to fund other criminal enterprises. The shell companies Chad created weren't just washing money for Pablo Pollard. They were also laundering Linda's profits from marriage fraud operations. The revelation expanded the federal investigation yet again. Linda hadn't just been Chad's accomplice. She'd been running her own parallel criminal organization that used Hull Construction as a financial clearinghouse for multiple illegal enterprises. But Greg's most satisfying discovery came from an unexpected source. During the investigation, Raphael had interviewed several of Linda's previous victims' children, now adults who'd spent years believing their fathers were abusive monsters. When presented with evidence of Linda's true nature, Many began to question the stories they'd been told. Sarah Webb, Marcus Webb's eldest daughter, called Greg personally after learning about the investigation. "I hated my father for 10 years before he killed himself," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I believed every lie that woman told about him. Now I know she murdered him as surely as if she'd pulled the trigger herself." Greg arranged for Sarah and several other victims' children to meet with federal prosecutors. Their testimony about Linda's psychological manipulation tactics provided crucial evidence for racketeering charges that could ensure she never had the opportunity to destroy another family. The web of corruption was finally being unraveled completely. Chad faced life in federal prison for money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy charges. The bribes to city officials had triggered a wider investigation that implicated dozens of contractors and government employees in a pay-to-play scheme that had been operating for years. Pablo Pollard's organization was being systematically dismantled as federal agents used Hull Construction's records to trace money laundering operations across the entire criminal network. Pollard himself had been arrested in a spectacular raid that yielded enough evidence to eliminate his organization permanently. But for Greg, the most important victory was Linda's complete destruction. She'd spent 15 years believing herself untouchable, superior to the men she'd manipulated and destroyed. Now she faced the rest of her life in federal prison, her true identity exposed, her criminal empire dismantled, her victims finally receiving justice. As Greg signed the final papers returning Hull Construction to legitimate operation, he reflected on the 4-year journey from homeless disgrace to victorious heir. The company his grandfather had built would survive and prosper, clean of the corruption that had nearly destroyed it. The fallen prince had reclaimed his throne, but more importantly, he'd ensure that the predators who tried to destroy his family would face consequences that matched their crimes. Justice, he'd learned, was indeed just accounting, and the books were finally balanced. Chapter 7. The Final Reckoning. 6 months after Chad's arrest, Greg stood in the federal courthouse watching his brother shuffle into the courtroom in shackles and an orange jumpsuit. The man who'd once commanded board meetings and political fundraisers now looked like a broken shell, his face gaunt from months of protective custody and his eyes constantly darting toward the gallery where Pablo Pollard's associates might be sitting. Judge Margie Allison, a no-nonsense veteran of the federal bench, reviewed the charges with methodical precision. Money laundering, racketeering conspiracy, bribery of public officials, tax evasion, and fraud, 23 separate federal charges that carried a combined maximum sentence of over 300 years. Chad's attorney, a harried public defender named Shane Jimenez, had already negotiated a plea agreement. In exchange for his cooperation against other members of the conspiracy, Chad would receive a sentence of 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. "Mr. Hull," Judge Allison addressed Chad directly, "do you understand that by accepting this plea agreement, you are admitting guilt to all charges and waiving your right to appeal?" Chad's voice was barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor. And do you understand that your cooperation with federal investigators has placed you in considerable personal danger?" "Yes, Your Honor." Greg felt no satisfaction watching his brother's humiliation. This wasn't revenge. It was simply the natural consequence of choices Chad had made over years of criminal behavior. Justice didn't require Greg's emotional investment, only his commitment to seeing truth revealed and consequences enforced. The gallery was packed with reporters, victims of Chad's crimes, and federal agents who'd spent months unraveling the conspiracy. Near the front sat Sarah Webb and 3 other children of Linda's previous victims, finally witnessing accountability for the woman who destroyed their families. Linda herself, no longer pretending to be Lynette Hull, would face sentencing the following week. Her trial had been a media sensation, with prosecutor Gail Simons methodically presenting evidence of 15 years of marriage fraud, identity theft, and psychological manipulation. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding her guilty on all 47 federal charges. But today belonged to Chad's reckoning. "Before I impose sentence," Judge Allison continued, I want to address the impact of your crimes on the community and your family. The corruption you facilitated damaged public trust in government institutions. The money laundering operation you enabled supported drug trafficking and violence that harmed countless innocent people. And your betrayal of family trust destroyed relationships that can never be fully repaired. Chad stood motionless as the judge's words washed over him. Greg wondered if his brother truly understood the magnitude of what he'd done, or if he still saw himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. However, the judge added, "Your cooperation has been substantial and valuable. Federal agents have indicated that your information led to the arrest and conviction of 37 additional defendants and a seizure of over $40 million in criminal assets." The cooperation had come at a cost. Pablo Pollard's organization had put a bounty on Chad's head that would follow him for the rest of his life. Even in federal prison, he needed protective custody to survive. "Chad Hull," Judge Allison announced, "I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison to be served in protective custody. You will also pay restitution of $12 million to victims of your crimes and forfeit all assets obtained through illegal activities." Chad swayed slightly as the sentence was imposed, but remained standing. Greg watched his brother's shoulders slump in acceptance of his fate, a quarter-century in a 6x8 cell, constantly looking over his shoulder for enemies who would never forgive his betrayal. As Chad was led away, Greg felt Detective Farley's hand on his shoulder. "Your father would be proud," Farley said quietly. "Justice was served here today." Greg nodded, but said nothing. Harold Hull's ghost could rest knowing that his company's honor had been restored and his true heir vindicated, but pride seemed like the wrong emotion for this moment. The following week brought Linda's sentencing, which proved even more dramatic than Chad's. She'd refused all plea agreements, maintaining her innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Her trial had revealed the full scope of her predatory career, with victim after victim testifying about the devastation she'd caused. Judge Allison's sentencing speech was scathing. "Linda Henderson, you have spent 15 years destroying families through systematic manipulation and fraud. You have shown no remorse for your crimes and no recognition of the suffering you've caused. Your actions represent a level of calculated cruelty that demands the severest response." Linda received 4 consecutive life sentences plus 60 years, ensuring she would die in federal prison regardless of appeals or good behavior. The woman who believed herself untouchable was removed from society permanently. As the courtroom cleared after Linda's sentencing, Greg found himself alone with Raphael Owen, who'd been instrumental in documenting the evidence that made justice possible. "Any regrets?" Raphael asked. Greg considered the question carefully. "I regret that it took 4 years for the truth to surface. I regret that other people were hurt by their crimes. But I don't regret that they're facing consequences for their choices." "What about forgiveness?" "Some people would say you have an obligation to forgive family. Forgiveness requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing and genuine remorse," Greg replied. "Chad spent 4 years destroying my life through lies and manipulation. Linda spent 15 years destroying multiple families for profit. Neither has shown any remorse for their actions, only anger being caught." Raphael nodded thoughtfully. "What's next for you?" Greg looked out the courthouse window at the city where he'd been born, fallen from grace, and ultimately reclaimed his place. Hull Construction was thriving under his leadership, its reputation restored through transparent operations and ethical business practices. The company was currently building low-income housing projects and veterans rehabilitation centers, causes that would have horrified Chad's profit-obsessed worldview. "I rebuild what they tried to destroy," Greg said finally. "Not just the business, but the trust and integrity that should define the Hull name." 6 months later, Greg stood in the restored Hull Construction headquarters, looking at photographs of 3 generations of Hull men who'd built the company from nothing. His grandfather's portrait showed a man who'd started with a single concrete truck and built an empire through honest work and fair dealing. His father showed a leader who'd expanded that empire while maintaining the family's reputation for integrity. Greg's own portrait, recently commissioned, showed a man who'd learned that true strength came not from avoiding adversity, but from surviving it with principles intact. The company now employed over 200 people and had contracts worth $40 million, all of it legitimate business based on competitive bidding and quality work. Greg had established a charitable foundation that supported victims of domestic fraud and psychological manipulation, ensuring that Linda's future victims would have resources for recovery and justice. He'd never married again, though several women had expressed interest in the wealthy, eligible bachelor who'd overcome such dramatic adversity. Trust, once broken so completely, was difficult to rebuild even with innocent people. But Greg had found peace in solitude and purpose in his work. Every successful project, every ethical business deal, every family helped by his foundation represented a victory over the forces that had tried to destroy him. The fallen prince had not just reclaimed his throne. He'd proven himself worthy of it through trials that would have broken a lesser man. And unlike the fairy tales, this story ended not with forgiveness and reconciliation, but with justice served and accounts balanced. Some betrayals were too profound for forgiveness. Some crimes demanded consequences that lasted a lifetime. Greg Hull had learned that mercy without justice was merely weakness, and that true strength sometimes required the courage to walk away from those who'd proven themselves unworthy of redemption. In the end, the price of betrayal had been paid in full, and Greg Hull could finally rest knowing that the dead were avenged and the living were protected from predators who'd learned too late that some men could not be broken, only strengthened by the trials they endured. Chapter 8. The Network's End. 1 year after the trials, Greg received an unexpected visitor at his office. Agent Kirsten Levine arrived with a thick file folder and the satisfied expression of someone who just closed a career-defining case. "The Pablo Pollard investigation is officially complete," she announced, setting the folder on Greg's desk. "I thought you'd want to see the final numbers." Greg opened the file to find a comprehensive summary of the criminal network's destruction. Pollard himself was serving life without parole after his organization's money laundering operation was exposed through Hull Construction's records. 63 associates had been arrested, tried, and convicted on various federal charges. Over $80 million in criminal assets have been seized and returned to victims. "Your brother's cooperation was instrumental," Agent Levine continued. Despite the personal danger, he provided information that led to arrests across 5 states and 2 countries. Greg felt no warmth toward Chad, despite his cooperation. Fear of Pablo Pollard's revenge had motivated his brother's assistance, not genuine remorse for his crimes. Chad was serving his sentence in protective custody at a federal prison in Colorado, where he would remain for the next 24 years. "What about the city corruption cases?" Greg asked. "Complete victory there as well. Terry McKee and Hugh Higgins both received 15-year sentences. The investigation expanded to include 12 other city employees who were taking bribes or kickbacks. The entire planning and zoning department has been restructured with new oversight procedures." The corruption cases have been personally satisfying for Greg, who'd watched honest contractors struggle to compete against companies that bought their approvals through bribes. Hull Construction's current success was built on merit rather than corruption, a fact that made every victory more meaningful. But the most important update concerned Linda Henderson's appeals. She exhausted her final appeal last month, Agent Levine reported. The Supreme Court declined to hear her case. She'll spend the rest of her life in federal prison, and her conviction has inspired investigations in 12 other states where she operated under different identities. Greg nodded grimly. Justice delayed was justice denied, but justice served completely was something approaching closure. "There's one more thing," Agent Levine added, pulling out a smaller file. "We recovered additional assets hidden in offshore accounts Linda established under various false identities. The total comes to just over $6 million. Restitution for her victims? Already distributed. Marcus Webb's children received substantial settlements, as did the families of her other victims. Your testimony about her psychological manipulation tactics was crucial in securing those judgments. Greg had testified at several victim restitution hearings, describing Linda's methods and the long-term damage she'd caused through systematic psychological abuse. Seeing the relief on victims' families' faces had been more satisfying than any financial compensation. After Agent Levine left, Greg walked through Hull Construction's offices, observing the honest work being done by people who'd rebuilt their careers after Chad's criminal leadership. Stuart Gleason had been promoted to chief financial officer after proving his integrity during the federal investigation. Amanda Chung had implemented ethics training programs that ensured future corruption would be impossible. The company's current projects reflected Greg's values rather than Chad's greed. They were building affordable housing for veterans, renovating schools in low-income neighborhoods, and constructing a new hospital wing that would serve the city's most vulnerable populations. Every project was bid competitively and completed within budget, restoring the Hull name's reputation for excellence and integrity. That evening, Greg visited his father's grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone read simply, Harold Hull, 1951 to 2024, beloved father and businessman. No mention of the mistakes that had nearly destroyed his legacy, only acknowledgement of the man who'd ultimately chosen truth over comfort. "It's finished, Dad," Greg said quietly, placing fresh flowers on the grave. "The company is clean, the criminals are in prison, and justice has been served. You can rest now." A light rain began to fall as Greg walked back to his car, washing the dust from his father's headstone and the courthouse steps where Chad and Linda had been sentenced. The city looked different now, cleaner somehow, as if the removal of corruption had allowed honest growth to flourish. Greg's phone buzzed with a text from Raphael Owen. "Pollard found dead in his cell this morning. Apparent suicide, but federal investigators are treating it as suspicious. Thought you should know." Greg deleted the message without responding. Pablo Pollard's death, whether suicide or murder, was justice of a different kind, the inevitable result of a criminal lifestyle that made enemies of everyone who mattered. Greg felt no satisfaction in the crime boss's demise, only relief that another dangerous predator had been permanently removed from society. The rain intensified as Greg drove through the city center, past the construction sites where Hull construction crews were building legitimately acquired projects, past the courthouse where justice had been served through proper legal channels, past the homeless shelter where Greg had once slept, now renovated with funds from his charitable foundation. For years ago, he'd been a broken man who'd lost everything through others' lies and manipulations. Tonight, he was a successful businessman who'd restored his family's honor through patience, planning, and unwavering commitment to truth. The fallen prince had become something better than royalty. He'd become a man who understood that true power came from integrity rather than corruption, from justice rather than revenge, from building rather than destroying. His enemies were imprisoned or dead, their criminal networks dismantled, their victims compensated. The accounts were balanced, the books closed, the story complete. Greg Hull drove home through the rain, satisfied that he'd proven the most important truth of all. Some men could be broken by betrayal, but others were only strengthened by it, tempered like steel in the fire of adversity until they became unbreakable instruments of justice. The price of betrayal had been paid in full, and Greg Hull could finally move forward knowing that the innocent were protected and the guilty had faced consequences that matched their crimes. Justice, after all, was just accounting, and these books were permanently closed. Chapter 9. Legacy of Justice. 5 years after Harold Hull's funeral, Greg stood on the balcony of his penthouse office, looking out over a city transformed by the removal of systemic corruption. Hull Construction had become the region's largest employer, with over 500 employees working on projects that serve the community rather than criminal enterprises. The company's motto, displayed prominently in the lobby, read simply, "Built on truth, founded on honor." The transformation hadn't been easy. Rebuilding trust after Chad's criminal leadership had required years of transparent operations, ethical business practices, and community engagement. Every contract was bid openly, every project completed within budget, Every employee held to the highest standards of integrity. Greg's secretary, Nina Gill, knocked on his door, carrying the morning's mail and newspapers. At 62, Nina had worked for Hull Construction for 30 years, surviving both Chad's criminal period and the company's rebirth under Greg's leadership. The morning papers, she said, setting down copies of local and national publications. You might want to see the front page of the Tribune. The headline read, Hull Construction wins National Ethics Award for Business Excellence. The article described Greg's transformation of the company from criminal enterprise to community pillar, highlighting the charitable foundation's work with fraud victims and the company's commitment to rebuilding trust through transparent operations. 5 years ago, Hull Construction was synonymous with corruption and scandal, the article stated. Today, under Greg Hull's leadership, it represents the highest standards of business ethics and community service. This remarkable transformation demonstrates that redemption is possible even after the most serious betrayals of public trust. Greg set the paper aside without reading the full article. Media attention made him uncomfortable, but he understood its value in demonstrating that legitimate business could be more successful than criminal enterprises. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Webb, Marcus Webb's daughter, who became a victims' rights advocate after her father's vindication, saw the article. Dad would be proud that his death led to something positive. Thank you for making sure Linda paid for what she did to all of us. Similar messages have been arriving all morning from victims' families, former employees, and community leaders who'd watched Greg's methodical restoration of his family's reputation. The fallen prince had become something unexpected, a symbol of redemption through justice rather than forgiveness. But the most significant message came from an unexpected source. Mr. Hull, Nina said, returning with a formal letter bearing federal letterhead. This just arrived by special courier. The letter was from Agent Levine, now promoted to supervise the FBI's white-collar crime division. Dear Mr. Hull, I wanted to inform you personally that Linda Henderson died in federal prison yesterday evening. Official cause of death was complications from cancer, though she'd been refusing treatment for several months. She maintained her innocence until the end and expressed no remorse for her crimes. Her death closes the final chapter on one of the most complex fraud cases in federal history. 15 families received justice because of your courage in exposing her true nature and providing evidence of her criminal pattern. The investigative techniques developed during her case have been used to identify and prosecute 17 other marriage fraud predators operating across the country. Chad Hull remains in protective custody and has reportedly found religion during his incarceration. He's expressed interest in speaking with you, though I understand if you prefer to maintain no contact. Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished. Justice served through proper channels is always preferable to vigilante revenge, and your commitment to legal processes helped ensure that dangerous criminals faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. Respectfully, Agent Kirsten Levine. Greg folded the letter and placed it in his desk, drawer alongside other correspondence from the various legal proceedings. Linda's death felt like the closing of a book he'd never asked to read, a final punctuation mark on a story of betrayal, justice, and redemption. He'd felt no satisfaction when Chad was sentenced, no triumph when Linda received life imprisonment, and no pleasure in learning of her death. Justice wasn't about emotional catharsis. It was about ensuring that consequences matched choices and that society was protected from those who'd proven themselves dangerous. That afternoon, Greg received another unexpected visitor. Stuart Gleason, now Hull Construction's chief financial officer, knocked on his door with an expression of barely contained excitement. Greg, you need to see this, Stuart said, spreading financial reports across the conference table. We just closed the biggest quarter in company history. Legitimate profits, ethical practices, competitive bidding, everything your grandfather would have wanted. The numbers were impressive. Hull Construction's annual revenue had reached $75 million, surpassing even the inflated figures from Chad's criminal period. More importantly, every dollar had been earned honestly through quality work and fair dealing. There's something else, Stewart continued. The Veterans Rehabilitation Center we built last year has been nominated for a National Architecture Award. The low-income housing project received recognition from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We're not just successful, we're making a difference. Greg studied the reports with satisfaction. Success built on integrity was more valuable than wealth obtained through corruption, though it had taken years to prove that principle in practice. As the afternoon wore on, Greg found himself thinking about Chad's request for a meeting. His brother had been imprisoned for 5 years, serving his sentence in protective custody while helping federal investigators dismantle the remains of Pablo Pollard's organization. By all accounts, he'd become a model prisoner who'd found religion and expressed remorse for his crimes. But remorse offered after punishment was meaningless. Chad's cooperation with authorities had been motivated by fear rather than conscience, and his conversion in prison was likely another manipulation designed to improve his circumstances. Greg had learned that forgiveness required genuine repentance, while justice demanded that consequences match choices. Chad had chosen betrayal, corruption, and criminality. He would serve his full sentence regardless of his current claims of redemption. That evening, Greg attended the annual Hull Foundation Charity Gala, an event that raised money for victims of financial fraud and domestic abuse. The ballroom was filled with business leaders, politicians, and community activists who'd supported his efforts to restore the Hull name's reputation. The keynote speaker was Dr. Amanda Chung, who'd left her psychology practice to become a full-time advocate for fraud victims. Her speech focused on the long-term psychological damage caused by financial predators and the importance of legal accountability in the healing process. "Justice delayed is justice denied," she said, but justice served completely allows victims to reclaim their lives and trust in social institutions. The Hull Foundation exists because Greg Hull understood that protecting future victims is more important than satisfying past grievances. The foundation had grown beyond Greg's initial vision. It now operated victim support centers in 12 states, provided legal assistance for fraud prosecutions, and funded research into the psychological techniques used by financial predators. Last year alone, it had helped convict 43 marriage fraud criminals and recovered over $20 million for their victims. As the gala concluded, Greg reflected on the journey from homeless disgrace to community leader. The fallen prince had discovered that true nobility came not from inherited position, but from earned respect, not from avoiding adversity, but from overcoming it with principles intact. His enemies were imprisoned or dead,